Day 1. Saturday. I should start before we got here. The thing about my job is that you develop a feel for things that don't fit the pattern. I survey coastlines. I assess erosion, storm damage, sediment shift. I've been doing it for 14 years, and you spend 14 years reading water and rock, and you start reading other things the same way, looking for what's out of place, what's shifted, what doesn't belong. 3 days before we came to the island, I was doing a routine survey about 40 miles north of the coast. Standard work, checking erosion benchmarks on a barrier spit that a county government wanted assessed before they committed to a beach nourishment project. I had my equipment, my truck, my radio. I was working alone, which I often do. The Coast Guard radio traffic started around midday. I have a Marine band radio in my truck. I keep it on as background habit, the same way some people keep the news on while they work. Coast Guard communications are usually routine: vessel traffic, weather advisories, the occasional distress call that gets resolved in 10 minutes. You stop hearing it consciously after a while. But that afternoon, something was different, and I couldn't have told you exactly what at first. It was like, you know how you can be in a room with a mechanical clock you've stopped hearing, and then the clock stops, and suddenly the silence is loud? It was like that, but in reverse. The radio traffic increased, and my brain registered it, even though I wasn't consciously listening. More voices, shorter transmissions, a kind of brevity that isn't normal. Coast Guard operators are trained to be precise, but they're also trained to be thorough. These transmissions were clipped, people cutting themselves off. I stopped what I was doing and actually listened. They were talking about vessels, multiple vessels in distress. I heard the number 11 mentioned in one transmission. Then a different operator said 17. 17 vessels simultaneously in distress was not normal. It's not impossible. A bad squall can do that. A sudden weather event. But the sky that day was clear and flat, and the wind was doing nothing unusual. Then I heard the phrase, persons in the water, condition unknown. Not drowning, not persons in need of assistance, condition unknown. I kept working. I told myself it was probably a multi-vessel collision, a fuel fire, something that would be all over the local news by evening. I finished my survey, drove back to the office, and filed my paperwork. That night I was on my laptop, and I searched the Coast Guard incident reports. Nothing. Nothing about 17 vessels. Nothing about persons in the water. I searched the local news and found one small article about a fishing vessel that had gone adrift with no crew aboard, recovered by a Coast Guard cutter and towed to port. The article said it was under investigation. One vessel in the news. 17 mentioned on the radio. I told Claire I was thinking about taking the family to Harwick Island that weekend. I'd surveyed Harwick twice in the last 6 years. It's small, maybe 4 acres, sits about 9 miles offshore, has a decommissioned lighthouse from the 1880s that the Historical Society occasionally talks about restoring, but never does. It has a dock that still functions, just barely. Fresh water source is unreliable, but there's a hand pump behind the lighthouse that pulls from a shallow well. Claire looked at me in that way she has, where she's deciding whether to ask the obvious question or let me work up to it on my own. She decided to let me work up to it. I said I thought it'd be nice. The kids could use the fresh air. Owen had been spending too much time indoors, and Nora had been asking about tide pools for months. Claire said okay. The next day, Friday, I went to work. But I spent the first 2 hours of the morning doing something I don't normally do, which was listening to radio traffic while I read through the Coast Guard's public incident log, and also reading a series of forums I occasionally check: marine weather, commercial shipping, that kind of thing. 3 things caught my attention. First, a fishing captain who operates out of a port about 60 miles north of us had posted in a commercial fishing forum the previous evening. He said he'd encountered a raft of floating debris, clothing, personal effects, what looked like the contents of a vehicle, spread across about 2 miles of open water. No vessel in sight, no distress beacon. He'd reported it to the Coast Guard and received what he described as an odd response. They asked him his exact position, told him to hold, came back 15 minutes later, and told him to continue on his route, and that the situation was being handled. He said in his post that he'd been fishing for 31 years, and the Coast Guard had never told him to continue on his route, away from potential survivors. Second, on a different forum, a recreational boater mentioned seeing a Coast Guard cutter anchored well outside the harbor mouth in unusual water. She said it looked like the cutter was maintaining a perimeter rather than operating, just sitting in position. She'd seen 2 other Coast Guard vessels in the same area over the prior 2 days. Third, and this one I couldn't explain away, I searched for any federal emergency management traffic, any state emergency declarations, any unusual law enforcement activity in the coastal counties. I found a brief mention buried in a local government meeting's minutes, something about a request from federal health authorities to temporarily suspend access to certain coastal zones pending assessment. The meeting minutes were from 4 days ago. The access suspension was described as precautionary and expected to be lifted within 72 hours. No news coverage of that suspension, none. I sat with it for a while. I want to be honest about what I thought at this point, because I don't want to rewrite the past and make myself look smarter or more certain than I was. I was not certain. I thought maybe 70% of me was reading a pattern that wasn't real. 42 years old. I've seen people build conspiracy theories out of coincidences, and I have always been the skeptic in the room. I'm a surveyor. I deal in measurement and data and physical reality. I'm not given to apocalyptic thinking. But the 30% that was reading a genuine pattern, that 30% was screaming. I called Claire from the work parking lot and told her to start packing for the weekend trip. I said pack for 3 or 4 days because I wanted to get a proper look at the lighthouse structure while we were out there, and I might need more time than a single day. I told her to pack food for a week, just in case, because island resupply is always uncertain. I said to bring the camping gear, the good sleeping bags, the water filter we'd bought 2 years ago for a kayaking trip we never ended up taking. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I was lying, and I think she knew I was lying, and she started packing. That evening I loaded the boat. We have a 24-foot center console, a Pathfinder that I use for survey work more than recreation. It has 2 fuel tanks, both full. I added 4 5-gallon fuel jugs to the storage compartment. I added my full survey kit, which includes tools and rope and more useful equipment than most people carry. I added a second marine band radio, a handheld one. I added the camping gear Claire had packed and the food. She'd done well. A week's worth of canned goods and dry goods, and some fresh things that wouldn't last but that we'd eat first. I almost left a note for a neighbor. I thought about it, standing in the garage at 10 at night with the boat already loaded. I thought about writing something down and leaving it somewhere, but I didn't know what I would have written. I didn't know what I thought was happening. I had a feeling. You don't write notes because of feelings. I wish I had written a note. I wish I had knocked on every door on our street and said, "Get out, get away from the city, go somewhere high and dry and isolated." I wish I had called my brother. I wish I had done 50 things differently. But I didn't, and we left at 6:30 Saturday morning, and the water was calm and gray, and the sky was doing nothing, and Owen sat up front with his headphones on, and Nora sat next to me at the helm, and watched the mainland disappear, and kept asking me if we'd see dolphins. And Claire stood at the stern with her coffee, and her hair pulled back, and looked at the water like she was trying to read it the same way I do. 9 miles out, the island came up out of the morning haze just after 8. I want to describe how Harwick looks, because I'm going to be writing about it for a long time, and I want to see it right. The island is shaped roughly like a boot, or maybe more like a question mark if you're being generous. The toe of the boot points south. The highest point is the lighthouse hill, northeast corner, maybe 60 feet above sea level. The lighthouse itself is about 40 feet of brick and mortar, octagonal, with a cast iron lantern room at the top that hasn't held a working light in decades. Below the lighthouse is the keeper's house, 2 stories, stone walls 18 inches thick, small windows, roof in worse shape than it looks from the water. Behind the keeper's house is a storage building, lower and longer, which used to hold equipment and supplies, and still holds a lot of old debris. There's a dock on the west side, protected from the prevailing wind and wave direction, a timber and concrete structure that still works despite its age. There's a beach on the south end, narrow gravel, where you can land a small boat in calm weather. Inland, the island is scrubby, beach grass and wind-bent shrubs, and a couple of stunted pitch pines that have been fighting the salt air for decades. The fresh water well is behind the keeper's house. Hand pump, occasionally sulfurous, but drinkable. There is no power, no phone signal, nothing. We docked at the west dock and I tied off, and we started carrying gear up the dock to shore. Owen took out one earbud and looked around and said, "So there's nothing here?" I said there was plenty here. You just had to know where to look. He put the earbud back in. Nora immediately ran toward the lighthouse and had to be redirected toward the keeper's house, where we were going to set up our base. I didn't want her going into the lighthouse without me checking it first. The stairs in those old structures can be unreliable, and I'd only been up there once, years ago during a survey. The keeper's house was in the condition I remembered. The front door had been forced at some point, not recently, probably years ago. Bored teenagers or recreational boaters looking for shelter. 2 of the downstairs windows were intact, single-pane old glass in rotting frames. Upstairs had 2 rooms, both damp but structurally sound. No furniture worth noting except an old wooden table in the kitchen area and some cabinet frames along the wall. The floor had soft spots, but nothing that went through. I walked every room, checked every corner, came back to the door. Nora was already asking about tide pools. We set up the tent in the grass behind the keeper's house. Claire and I in one sleeping area, Nora with her sleeping bag in the tent's second compartment, Owen in the hammock he'd insisted on bringing. It wasn't camping season in the conventional sense. This was late in the year. The nights were cold. The wind off the water was persistent and damp. But we had the right gear, and we'd camped in worse. The first part of that day was, I almost don't want to write this. It feels strange to say. It was nice. It was genuinely good. Nora found the tide pools on the southern beach and spent 2 hours cataloging what she found. Owen, despite himself, put the headphones away around noon and climbed the lighthouse stairs with me, which required some careful navigation around 2 missing risers, and stood in the lantern room and looked out at the water in every direction and said, quietly, "This is actually kind of cool." Claire and I made lunch from the cooler and sat on a flat rock above the dock and drank coffee from the thermos and watched the water. I kept looking at the mainland. From the lighthouse you can see the coastline clearly on a good day, maybe 25 miles of it, the low edge of land with the taller buildings of the city visible on the southern horizon. That's about 20 miles of open water between Harwick and the nearest point of the coast. I looked at the mainland from the lighthouse at around 1 in the afternoon, and everything looked normal. No smoke, no unusual vessel traffic, nothing. I looked again at 3, after Nora dragged me to see something she'd found in the tide pool that turned out to be a common hermit crab, and everything still looked normal. I stood up there for 10 minutes and let myself start to breathe a little. By 4 in the afternoon, my phone had exactly 1 bar. Text messages were going through but slowly. I got a text from my colleague Dan, we sometimes share survey contracts, asking if I'd seen the news out of Portland. I texted back asking what news. He didn't reply for 40 minutes, and when he did it just said, "Wild stuff. Probably nothing." I don't know what he meant. I've thought about it since. Probably nothing. We ate dinner around a small camp stove and a fire I'd built in a ring of rocks near the keeper's house. Canned soup heated up, bread from the cooler, some fruit. Nora had gotten loud and overexcited the way she gets when she's fighting tiredness, and Owen was quieter than usual in a way that actually seemed comfortable rather than sullen. Claire sat close to me and didn't say much, and occasionally her hand found my arm in the dark. I checked the radio after dinner. Marine band. The traffic was heavier than it should have been for a Saturday evening in this region. Nothing I could pin down, but the rhythm was wrong again. I turned it off before Claire could hear enough to ask questions. Nora went to sleep first. Owen went to the hammock with his book and his flashlight. Claire and I lay in the tent, and she asked me, quietly, "You going to tell me what this is actually about?" I told her I wasn't sure. I told her I'd heard some things on the radio and seen some reports that seemed off, and I'd wanted us somewhere that wasn't the city, while I figured out if it was real. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You've been doing this for 20 years. Your gut wrong before? I told her my gut had been wrong, plenty of times. She said, often? I said, not often. She said, okay. She went to sleep before I did. I lay there and listened to the ocean on 3 sides of the island, and the wind moving through the pitch pines, and I thought about what I might be wrong about what pattern I might be misreading. I tried to reassemble the pieces in a way that made them benign. Vessel traffic, coastal access suspension, a fishing captain being told to continue his route. I fell asleep eventually. The last thing I remember is the sound of a buoy bell somewhere in the channel, regular and dull and endless. Wednesday 2, Sunday. I was up at 5:30, before anyone else. I made coffee on the camp stove and walked to the top of the lighthouse hill. The mainland was on fire. Not all of it. Not the whole coast. Not buildings in flames from one end to the other. But there were columns of smoke, 3 of them, visible in the early light, dark and vertical against the gray sky. One near the city's southern industrial area, or where I thought that was from this distance. 2 more further north, less concentrated, spreading as they rose. I stood there for a long time, with my coffee getting cold. My phone had no signal, 0 bars. I pulled out the handheld marine radio and tuned through the channels. Coast Guard traffic on Channel 16 was dense, voice after voice, controlled but strained. Coordinates and vessel names and the phrase, unresponsive persons, recurring like a chorus, in a song you can't get out of your head. I heard someone say, do not approach, repeat, do not approach until, and then nothing, and whoever it was didn't come back. Another transmission, a different voice, saying something about the harbor being compromised and recommending all vessels maintain at least 2 nautical miles from the harbor entrance. 2 nautical miles from the harbor entrance. That's a significant exclusion zone. I went back down, started breakfast. Eggs and toast. By the time Owen and Nora were awake, Claire had found me in the keeper's house kitchen, and she could tell from my face that something had changed. She looked at me and looked away and started helping with the food. I didn't want to tell the kids yet. I needed more information. After breakfast, I told them I was going to do some survey work on the South Beach, and that Claire was in charge. I took the handheld radio and walked to the southern tip of the island, where I could sit on a rock above the water and look at the coast without the lighthouse, and the house between me and the view. More smoke now. 5 columns. The 2 northern ones had merged into a single wide smear across the low sky. A boat drifted past about a 1/4 mile offshore, moving south, no power, no anchor, just the current taking it. A small power boat, maybe 18 feet, white with a green stripe, the kind of thing someone bought to fish on weekends. Nobody on it that I could see. No distress signals. No radio beacon. Just empty, drifting south with the tide like a shoe left in a creek. I watched it until it passed out of sight. Then another one. 20 minutes later. A kayak this time. Bright orange. One of the pedal drive types that cost more than my first car. Empty. Moving north, which meant it was tracking a different current, or wind-driven. It bumped against the rocks at the south point, scraped, and spun away from the island. I went back to the camp. Owen had climbed to the lantern room on his own. He came back down looking serious, which is not his default expression. He said, "Dad, there's smoke on the mainland. A lot of smoke." I said I'd seen it. He said, "What's happening?" I said I didn't know yet. He looked at me in the way teenagers look at you when they suspect you know more than you're saying, but they're not sure whether to push. He decided not to push. Not yet. He went and sat by the fire ring with his hands wrapped around a water bottle and stared at the lighthouse. I told Claire everything I'd seen. The smoke, the boats, what I'd heard on the radio. She listened without interrupting, which is something I've always appreciated about her. She doesn't try to fill silence before she's ready to speak. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Are we staying?" I said yes. She nodded slowly. "How long?" I said I didn't know. I said whatever was happening over there was not good, and the island was safer than the mainland right now, and we should stay until the situation clarified. She said, "What about Owen's school? My job?" I said I thought those things were probably not going to be the main concern pretty soon. That was the moment where I think Claire really understood. Not just that I'd brought them here to be safe, but what I thought we were being safe from. She has a very still face when she's scared. It doesn't go pale or pinched. It goes still, like water in a windless moment. She said, "Okay, we stay." We made the decision together, and neither of us said the word we were both thinking. We didn't say it in front of the kids that day. We didn't say it at all, until 3 days later. Afternoon. I did something I should have done immediately. I went through the lighthouse storage building, the long, low one behind the keeper's house, and inventoried what was there. The storage building is maybe 60 feet long by 20 wide. Stone walls, corrugated metal roof, with several holes that let in light and rain. It had held the old lighthouse equipment, fuel tanks for the light, supply storage, equipment maintenance area. Most of what it held was junk, rusted tools, broken glass from old kerosene lanterns, coils of rope so old they crumbled when I picked them up. But, at the far end, behind a rack of rotting wooden crates, I found a door I hadn't noticed during previous surveys. It was a heavier door than the rest of the building. Steel framed, painted over so many times the paint was almost an inch thick. It was latched, not locked. I opened it. Cold air, dry cold air, which meant it was partially sealed somehow. The room behind the door was about 15 by 15 feet. Concrete floor, concrete ceiling, stone walls with a moisture barrier that had mostly held, shelving along 3 walls, and on those shelves, I stood there for a long time just looking. It was a Cold War-era supply cache. I recognized it because I've seen a few of them in my survey work. Coastal installations all through the 50s and 60s were stocked with emergency supplies by civil defense authorities. Most of them were emptied and decommissioned long ago. This one apparently wasn't. Metal drums of water, but I didn't trust them. 40 years in a drum is pushing it. The seals were probably compromised. Stacked flat cans that I recognized as civil defense survival biscuits. Awful but edible, and shelf-stable, essentially forever. Cases of canned goods, older labels, most of the cans intact. A hand-cranked radio receiver. Flares, sealed in a metal case. First aid supplies, outdated but many still viable. A Geiger counter that I had no use for, but that was still sitting there in its olive drab case like it was waiting. And in the corner, wrapped in canvas sheeting and tied with rope, a generator. Small, maybe 3 kilowatt, diesel-powered. And next to it, a 50-gallon drum of diesel fuel with a hand pump, sealed and, when I cracked the lid and smelled it, still okay. Old diesel degrades but doesn't go useless, especially in a sealed container. I stood in that room for a long time. Then I went back out and stood in the main storage building and looked around it with new eyes. The structure was sound. The walls were thick stone, and the holes in the roof were in the middle sections, away from the walls. If I plugged the roof holes somehow and secured the main doors, this building was more defensible than the keeper's house. The inner room gave additional security. There was room in here for all of us. I didn't tell anyone yet. I wanted to think. That evening, the 5th empty boat drifted past the island. Nora asked why all the boats had nobody on them. I told her they were probably anchor dragging, boats that had come loose from their moorings in bad weather. She said there hadn't been bad weather, and I said sometimes the anchors were set wrong to begin with. She thought about this and said, "That seems like a big mistake." Owen said nothing, but he watched the boat until it was gone. Day 3, Monday. I woke up at 4 in the morning to the sound of something I'd never heard before, and couldn't immediately identify. It was a low-frequency sound coming from the direction of the mainland. Not an explosion. Too sustained. Not a siren. Something between a horn and a tone, cycling slowly. I got out of the tent and stood in the cold darkness and listened. It was the emergency broadcast tone, the emergency alert system tone, but not from a radio, from the mainland itself, from across 20 miles of water. It was amplified enough to carry across the water, which meant they were broadcasting it at serious volume, which meant every speaker and outdoor alert system that was still functioning on the coast was running it simultaneously. I went to the handheld radio, EAS broadcast on the AM frequencies. I tuned through. I found it. The automated voice, flat and mechanical, saying something about a public health emergency and urging citizens to shelter in place and avoid contact with unknown individuals and not to approach persons displaying signs of erratic behavior. Erratic behavior. This message will repeat. Please stand by for official guidance. It repeated 3 times, then went to static. I sat on the ground outside the tent and held the radio and thought about the phrase, erratic behavior, and what it was a euphemism for. I knew, you know. Everyone who's ever watched a movie or read a book or played a game knows. We all know the template. We filed it away under fiction. I had filed it under fiction. But drifting boats and coastal exclusion zones, and 17 vessels in distress, and smoke columns over the city, and now an emergency broadcast tone at 4 in the morning about erratic behavior. There's a point at which the pattern becomes undeniable. It wasn't fiction. I sat on the ground on a 9-acre island, 9 miles from the coast, and I felt the specific cold dread of realizing that the thing you were afraid of was real. Not abstract afraid, not reading the news afraid. Real. It was real, and it was over there, and we were here. Here. Where I had put my family. I hadn't told anyone where we were going except Claire, and she hadn't told anyone except maybe a text to her sister on Friday saying we were doing a weekend camping thing. The dock we'd left from was a private dock at the end of a road that not many people knew. Nobody knew we were at Harwick. For the first time since this started, that felt like the right thing. I made a list in my head of what we had. Food, the camping supplies Claire had packed, roughly a week's worth at normal consumption, more if we stretched it. The civil defense cash added significantly to that. Canned goods and survival biscuits could extend us to a month easily. Water, the well pump, the civil defense drums if I could determine whether they were still safe to use. And we had 2 5-gallon water jugs we'd brought from the boat. Rain collection, I needed to set something up. Fuel, the boat tanks and 4 jugs of gas, plus the diesel drum in the storage room. Communications, 2 Marine Band radios, the civil defense hand-cranked receiver. Tools, my full survey kit, and whatever was in the storage building. We were okay for a while. That was the thought I held on to. I started making actual plans. When Claire woke up at 6, I told her about the emergency broadcast. I didn't make her guess what it meant. I told her plainly. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her the 3 main things. Secure the storage building as our main shelter. Set up rain collection. Start rationing the food from the cooler while leaving the canned goods for later. She said, "What about getting off the island?" I said I needed more information before we did anything. Going back to the mainland right now, without knowing what was actually happening there, wasn't something I was willing to risk. She said, "And if it doesn't get clearer?" I said we'd be fine for a while, longer than most people. She looked at me with that still face, and then she nodded and said, "Tell the kids after breakfast." I told Owen and Nora after breakfast. Owen took it better than I expected. He went quiet, and then he started asking practical questions. How much food? Was the well water safe? Could we get internet from the boat's equipment? He didn't panic. He sat with the information and processed it, and came out the other side in a practical mode. That was Owen at his best. He had it in him when he needed it. Nora cried. Not from panic, I don't think. She's 8, and she didn't fully understand the scope of it. She cried because she'd left her favorite stuffed animal at home, a rabbit called, I can't even write this without, called Professor Ears. She'd been leaving things behind for years, and it always hit her the same way. Claire held her and said they'd figure it out, and Nora said she wanted to go home, and Claire said they couldn't go home right now. Nora cried for a while, and then she stopped, and she asked if she could go look for sea glass on the South Beach. I said yes. We spent the rest of Monday turning the storage building into a livable shelter. This took all 4 of us, and most of the day. Owen and I worked on the roof holes, while Claire and Nora sorted and organized the space. The roof was corrugated metal and the holes were rust failures, 4 of them varying in size from a hand to a dinner plate. I found sheets of corrugated metal in a pile against the back of the building, old salvage from something, and I used roofing screws from my survey kit's tool bag to patch 3 of the 4 holes. The 4th was too large, and I stretched a section of heavy canvas over it and secured it with screws on the edges. Not weatherproof, but functional. The main door to the building was a pair of old wooden doors that swung outward. They had a bar latch on the inside, but the wood had warped, and the latch was unreliable. I braced a length of timber across the doors from inside, which I couldn't use from the outside, but which would hold against anything trying to push the doors inward. I thought about why I was thinking about things trying to push the doors inward. I pushed the thought aside. The inner room, the cold storage room with the civil defense supplies, I cleaned out and opened fully. We moved sleeping gear in there, sleeping bags and the tent's sleeping mat, and a folding foam pad I found in the storage building. 4 people in a 15 by 15 room is tight, but it's warm from body heat and it's dry and the door is solid. Claire organized the food. She made a proper inventory, everything on paper, which she is better at than I am. She's an accountant. She thinks in columns and rows, and her food inventory was a proper ledger. Dated, quantities, estimated days of use at different consumption levels. She handed it to me when she was done, and I looked at it. At current normal consumption, 16 days. At 2/3 rations, 24 days. At half rations, 32 days. I said good, and she said, 32 days of what though? I said I was working on that. The well water, I decided, was safe enough. I'd used it before during surveys. It had that faint sulfur smell, but it wasn't harmful. I cranked it through the filter we'd brought and filled both of our 5-gallon jugs. I also found 3 5-gallon plastic buckets in the storage building that I cleaned and positioned under the corrugated roof edges where rain would channel. It had rained briefly in the night, and the gutters were mostly functional, which was something. That evening, around sunset, I went to the south end of the island and stood on the rocks above the water and watched the mainland. The smoke was different now. It wasn't columns anymore. It was a continuous haze, brownish gray, sitting low against the coast like a fog that had come up from the wrong direction. And there was light, orange light, diffuse, spread across the dark horizon. Not point sources, more like the glow of a city, the way you see cities from distance at night, except wrong. Too orange. The wrong color for sodium lights. The city was burning. Not part of it. Most of it. I stood there until Nora called for me from the camp. I went back. I didn't sleep much. I lay in the inner room with my family asleep around me, and listened to the water outside, and thought about what was happening over there, and tried not to. Day 4, Tuesday. 2 things happened on Tuesday that I need to record carefully. The first, at about 10 in the morning I was on the dock, checking the boat's fuel levels and looking at the water, and I saw something in the channel about 100 yards off the west side of the island. Something in the water. At first I thought it was a seal. We get gray seals out here. They're big and they move strangely. But it wasn't moving like a seal. It was moving like a person. Arms at the sides, face in the water, body roughly horizontal, not swimming. Drifting. I watched it for a long time. It came slowly toward the island on the tide, close enough that I could see it was a person, an adult, wearing clothing, no life jacket, face down. I didn't call out. Some part of me knew. It drifted past the island's western point and continued south. It didn't wash ashore. The current took it around the tip and away. I sat on the dock for a while after it passed. The second thing. In the afternoon I heard Owen shout from the north side of the island, a sharp sound that brought me to my feet and moving before I'd thought about it. I ran to the north point and found Owen standing at the top of a low bluff about 15 feet above the water, pointing. There was a small aluminum skiff below, caught against the rocks at the base of the bluff, 18 feet or so. Basic fishing setup, the kind of boat you see everywhere up and down the coast. It was wedged in the rocks at an angle, and the tide was keeping it there, pushing it steadily against the stone. In the skiff was a person. A man. I could see him from the bluff. He was on the floor of the boat, on his side, legs bent at an odd angle. He wasn't moving. I told Owen to stay and climbed down the bluff on a route I'd scrambled up during my survey years ago. I got to the rocks at the base and got close enough to the skiff to see him clearly. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans and work boots. Early 60s, I thought. Gray hair, a beard. His eyes were open and he was looking at the bottom of the boat, and he wasn't blinking. His mouth was slightly open. He looked dead. Then he moved. Just his hand. His right hand, which was resting against the aluminum floor of the skiff, twitched. Fingers curling, then uncurling, then nothing, then again. I called out to him. No response. I watched him for a full minute. The hand moved twice more. Nothing else. His neck, on the side facing up, there was a wound. A wound that I don't want to describe in more detail than necessary. A bite wound. The skin was torn and the blood was mostly dried, but the wound was bad. Bad enough that, well, he shouldn't have been alive. But he was. I stood on those rocks for a long time, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The twitching hand was, I don't know what it was. It wasn't coordinated movement. It was the kind of movement that happens in a body before the body fully understands that it needs to stop. I left him in the skiff. I climbed back up the bluff, and I told Owen the man was very badly injured, and we couldn't help him, and we needed to leave the North Point alone. Owen said, "Was he?" And then he stopped himself and said, "Is he dead?" I said he would be soon. Owen looked at me for a moment, and then looked back at the skiff, which you could just see the bow of from where we were standing. Then he said, "Yeah, okay." We walked back to camp. I told Claire quietly. She asked what I was going to do. I said if the tide didn't carry the skiff off the rocks, I'd need to deal with it, but the tide should take care of it by evening. I said I'd check at low water tonight. At low tide, the skiff was still there. The man was still in it. He wasn't moving anymore. The hand had gone still. The wound on his neck looked different in the flashlight beam. Darker, the edges pulling in a way that wounds do when the blood supply is gone. The tide was going to keep the skiff pinned for a while. The water wasn't going to take it tonight. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in the inner room and listened to the others breathe, and thought about the man in the skiff, and the bite wound, and the twitching hand, and outside, the waves were working at the rocks, and the wind came through the patched roof in a low whistle. Day 5, Wednesday. In the morning I took a long boat hook from the dock and went to the North Point, and I pushed the skiff off the rocks at high water. The man was in it, still. The boat pivoted away from the rocks, and the current took it slowly, and then the wind caught it, and within 20 minutes, it was clear of the island and moving south-southwest in the general tidal flow. I watched it go until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went back to camp and didn't talk about it. This was the day we started properly living on the island rather than camping on it. There's a difference. Camping on the island meant treating it as temporary. Living on it meant treating it as home, which meant making decisions accordingly. We moved everything into the storage building. Everything. The tent, the sleeping bags, all the food supplies combined with the cash supplies, the radios, my toolkit, the water jugs. We set up a living area in the main storage space and sleeping quarters in the inner room. Claire rigged a curtain from an old canvas tarp across the doorway between the two spaces for some separation. She arranged the sleeping area with the efficiency of someone who builds order under pressure. Sleeping bags assigned by position. Owen's along the right wall, Nora's in the corner, hers and mine along the left wall near the inner room's door, which we could brace from inside. Owen set up a camp table in the main area that he'd found in the debris pile. He organized it as a kitchen, camp stove in the center, fuel canisters stacked under, cooking supplies arranged by type. He did this without being asked. Just did it. I stood in the doorway and watched him work and felt something I can't quite name, pride mixed with grief.
He was 15, and he was setting up a kitchen in an abandoned storage building on an island, while the mainland burned. And he was doing it carefully, doing it right.
Nora had found a broom somewhere in the debris, a proper push broom, bristles mostly intact, and she was sweeping the concrete floor of the inner room with total seriousness, moving from one end to the other in straight parallel strokes. She found a dead spider and announced it was evacuated and kept sweeping. I went and did the rain collection setup I'd been planning. I salvaged what I could of the lighthouse station's old guttering system. Some sections were intact and connected to downspouts that went to nothing, the old cistern having collapsed decades ago. I redirected the downspouts into my collection buckets. Rough work, not pretty, but functional. A 1-inch rainfall on this roof would give us maybe 40 gallons in those 3 buckets, which was more than we needed for drinking at any given time. Water was solvable. Food was on a clock. Protection was, I kept putting that thought off. I kept telling myself that nobody was going to reach this island. 9 miles of open water. No power, no signal, nothing to draw attention. We were invisible. But the boats were still drifting. 6 or 7 a day now, by my count, going past the island, or catching briefly on the south beach and floating off. I stopped counting. Late Wednesday afternoon, the civil defense hand-crank radio picked up something other than static. I'd been running through the shortwave frequencies, not expecting much, when I hit a clear voice. Not an automated broadcast. A person. A man's voice, measured and flat, reading coordinates and status updates like someone who had done it 100 times. Military, clearly. The cadence, the vocabulary. I caught the phrase, perimeter holding, and then, estimated contamination rate in urban zones, and then the signal dropped into static. I cranked the handle again. Signal came back, weaker. I heard, recommend all civilian vessels maintain, and then static. I tried for another 20 minutes and got nothing usable. But there was a military radio presence. That meant there were still functioning military units. That was information. That night I sat outside the storage building for a while after the others were in bed. The sky was clear for the first time, and there were more stars than I'd seen in a long time. No light pollution from the mainland, which is normally visible as a faint orange smear on the horizon. Dark coast, dark city, nothing. The night was very quiet. Wind had dropped. The water around the island was flat and dark, and I could hear the tide running along the dock pilings, that rhythmic watery sound, and nothing else. And then, not from the water, from the south beach, which was to my right and around the corner of the storage building, I heard something. A splash. Then another. Then nothing. I sat absolutely still for a long time. Animals sometimes came ashore on these islands. Seals, occasionally otters. Once I'd seen a coyote on a barrier island that it had clearly swum to from somewhere. A seal on the south beach wasn't impossible. But seals don't splash like that. Seals are smooth and quick, in and out of the water. These splashes had a different rhythm. Irregular, like something entering the water or leaving it clumsily. I went back inside and made sure the timber brace was across the main door. Then I lay down and did not sleep. Day 6, Thursday. At first light I walked to the south beach. The gravel was disturbed. Clear as anything. The stones moved in a line from the water's edge up the beach, and then across the grass above the tide line and into the scrubby growth at the south end of the island. I crouched and looked at the tracks. Footprints in the soft ground above the gravel. Human. Adult male, probably. The length and stride were consistent with that. 2 feet, both tracking forward. Moving slow. The stride was short and irregular. I followed the tracks into the scrub growth. The scrubby area at the south end of the island is about an acre. Beach grass and salt spray rows and some low shrubs that I don't know the name of, twisted and dense enough to make walking through them uncomfortable. The tracks went in about 30 feet and then stopped at a flat area of exposed rock. Whoever or whatever had made them had either gone back into the water from the rocks, there were scrape marks on the stone, or had gone north into the island's interior. I stood in the scrub and listened for several minutes. Birds, wind picking up, the tide starting to ebb, nothing else. I went back and got the boat hook from the dock. I'm going to be honest about the boat hook. It was the only thing I had that was substantial enough to keep something at a distance. I have a folding knife, which is a tool I carry for survey work. I had nothing else. The island had nothing in the way of conventional weapons. I hadn't thought about weapons because we were camping for a long weekend. I went back to the scrub with the boat hook and walked every line of it, twice. I found the place where the tracks stopped on the exposed rock and nothing more. I found where the scrape marks went to the water on the eastern side of the south point. Whatever it was, had gone back into the water. Had it gone all the way? Or was it somewhere in the island's interior that I hadn't found? I searched the island, all of it. 4 acres isn't large, but scrubby terrain takes time. 2 hours. I found a cormorant nest, 3 different areas where drift material had accumulated, a tangle of lost fishing gear, a section of old fencing that had once marked something, now fallen, rusted. No people, nobody hiding, no signs of recent habitation. I went back to camp and thought about what to tell Claire. I told her everything. We'd established that rule in the first days. She gets everything. No filtered information. She listened and said, "What came out of the water?" I said I didn't know. She said, "But you have a theory." I said yes. She said, "The tides bring things. The boats brought things." I said yes. She said, "And you think whatever it was went back in the water?" I said I thought so. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I want you to stay near the building today." I said okay. We didn't go to the South Beach that day. Nora asked to, and I said the beach was too rocky at low tide, which wasn't a lie, exactly, and that we'd go tomorrow. She accepted this with minor protest. I spent the afternoon improving the storage building's security in every practical way I could think of. I nailed boards across the lower sections of the exterior windows, leaving the upper portions open for light and air. I sorted through the debris pile and found more timber sections that I could use to reinforce the main door. I rigged a warning system along the most likely approach routes, scavenged fishing lines strung low between fixed points, with a collection of metal scraps and old hardware clipped to the line so that anything walking into it would make noise. These were not military defenses. These were the best I could do. Owen helped without asking why. He asked one question. "How many do you think came ashore?" I said just the one, as far as I could tell. He said, "But if one can, others can." I said yes. He nodded and went back to nailing boards. Day 7, Friday. A week. I wrote that at the top of the page and looked at it. 1 week. 7 days ago, we were loading the boat in the dark. 7 days ago, Owen was complaining about the early wake-up and Nora was asking about dolphins. We still haven't seen dolphins. The morning was quiet, overcast, wind from the northwest that was cold and smelled like the open Atlantic rather than the coast. That's a particular smell. Clean, salt-stripped, without any of the organic notes the nearshore water carries. It clears your head, or it makes you feel very small depending on your state of mind. I was on the dock at 7 when I saw the first other boat with people on it since we'd arrived. It was coming from the south, heading roughly north. A center console boat, newer than mine, probably 26 feet, moving fast. 20-something knots by the look of the wake. 2 people visible in it. They were moving past the island's west side about a half-mile out. I didn't signal them. I didn't wave. I didn't try to attract their attention. I stood on the dock and watched them go north and then went back to camp. Claire asked if I'd seen anything, and I said a boat going north. 2 people, in a hurry. She said, "Should we have flagged them down?" I said I didn't know who they were, or what they'd been through, or what they'd do if they found an island with supplies and a shelter. I said, "Not everyone who's survived a week of this is someone you want to invite to the island." She looked at me for a moment, then said, "That's a grim way to think." I said I hoped it was wrong. The afternoon was rain, real rain, the kind that moved in fast off the northwest wind and dropped temperature 10 degrees in an hour. We were inside the storage building when it hit, and the rain collection system I'd set up worked. I could hear the water running into the buckets, a satisfying sound that I'd never particularly noticed before. We had good rain. We had full buckets by evening. During the rain, I went through the civil defense supplies in detail. Proper inventory, like Claire had done with the food. I wrote down everything and the condition of each item. The survival biscuits, 12 sealed tins, each containing approximately 2,000 calories of dense compressed crackers. Not good, not even close to good, but edible and calorie-dense and stable. I could extend our food supply significantly with these. Canned goods, 41 cans of varying type and condition, some swollen. I set those aside to go in the water, not worth the risk. Most solid. Beans, corn, peas, condensed soup, a few cans of corned beef and canned chicken in a stew that I didn't recognize the brand of, but that seemed intact. 37 viable cans. First aid, antibiotics, expired, but expiration dates on most antibiotics are conservative. Bandages, antiseptic, surgical tape, a suture kit that I genuinely hoped we wouldn't need. Aspirin, antihistamines, 2 wrapped sterile scalpels, a blood pressure cuff which was useless here, but was thorough. Nora's asthma inhaler, she'd brought her current one but only one refill, was more pressing to me than any of this other medical gear. We had 3 weeks of asthma medication at current usage. I made a note of that. The generator. I tested it in the afternoon, running it briefly in the main storage area with the door open for ventilation. It worked. Old diesel ran in it roughly, but it ran. 3 kilowatts of power. Without fuel-efficient equipment to run, it wasn't transformative. We didn't have lights that needed it, and the radio ran on hand crank or batteries. But it was there. It was another option. The Geiger counter. I tested it out of curiosity. Background radiation. Normal. Nothing interesting. The flares. 8 in the metal case. 2 aerial. 6 handheld. I filed this under last resort only. Lighting a flare on this island would be visible for 20 miles. I wrote all of this into the logbook and looked at the totals and revised Claire's food estimate. With the cash integrated into the supply plan at 2/3 rations, 32 days became 57 days. Almost 2 months of food, which was either a lot or not enough, depending on what was happening over there on the coast. Day 8, Saturday. One of the infected came ashore on the South Beach. I'm going to describe this accurately because it matters. I need to understand what I'm dealing with. Owen was the one who saw it. He'd gone to the South Beach to look at the sea glass collection Nora had started there. She'd been keeping pieces sorted by color in a row of small wooden boards she'd found in the debris pile, and he came back at a run. I was at the well pump, he said, fast and low, not to alarm Nora. Dad, there's a man on the beach. I got the boat hook. Owen and I went to the South Beach. He was there, the infected. Male, probably mid-40s, wearing what had been dress clothes, a dark shirt and slacks, both saturated and torn. He'd come out of the water onto the beach, and he was moving up the gravel, slowly, in no apparent direction. Just forward, head down, both arms at his sides barely swinging, moving like someone walking through chest-deep water on land. We stood at the top of the beach about 30 feet away and I watched him. He hadn't seen us. He wasn't looking. His head was down, and his trajectory was roughly toward the south end of the scrub area, which was to the left of where we stood. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't sniffing the air or lifting his head to listen. He was just moving. I watched him for 2 full minutes. He covered maybe 10 feet in that time. He was moving on an angle that was going to take him past us and into the scrub to the south. And then Owen sneezed. The sound was small. A single sneeze, involuntary, immediately muffled as Owen pressed his hands to his face. He looked at me in horror. The infected's head came up. It turned, slowly, like the turn was on a rusty pivot, in our direction. And it changed. The walk changed. The shamble became a lurch, and the lurch became something faster, and it was coming toward us. I said, "Run." Owen ran back toward camp, and I backed up along the beach for a moment, watching it come, trying to gauge the speed. It was fast enough. Not fast like a person who's running, not sprinting. But it wasn't the shamble anymore either. It had locked onto the sound, and it was moving toward it, and it was going to close the distance in maybe 30 seconds. I turned and ran. I ran to the main storage building, where Owen had already arrived and was holding the door open. We went in, and I pulled the door and threw the timber brace into place. Claire was there, immediately, hand on Nora's shoulder, and Nora had her mouth open to ask something, and Claire said very quietly, just once, "Hush." We listened. Outside, nothing for about a minute. Then, Footsteps on the gravel that made up the area around the building's exterior. Slow, uneven, that same shuffling drag I'd seen on the beach, moving along the outside wall to the south, stopping, moving again. It went around the south wall, then the east wall, which had the rain collection buckets, then the north wall, where the entrance was. It stopped at the door. I could hear it, a sort of shuffling, shifting sound, and then a pressure on the door. Not a knock or a pound, a sort of leaning, a pushing, like something was pressing its weight against the door. The timber brace held. It pressed again, and then it stopped. We waited. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the door, around the south wall again. I heard it bumping against the rain collection guttering, then silence. I waited 10 minutes. I moved the brace and opened the door the width of my hand and looked out. The area around the building was empty. I opened it further and stepped out. I walked the building's perimeter. Nothing. I went to the south beach. It was gone. Back in the water, probably, with the tide. The footprints in the gravel showed where it had been. The same heavy drag step pattern I'd seen before. I went back inside. Nora was pressed against Claire's side, completely silent, eyes wide. I said it had gone. Claire said how. I said back to the water. She said would it come back. I said I didn't know. That night we established new rules. No loud sounds. No running. When on the beach or the open parts of the island, voices low. If any of us spotted one coming ashore, the signal was 2 short taps on the nearest hard surface. Like knocking on wood. Quiet. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Owen said quietly, that evening. So they follow sound. I said yes, that's what it looked like. He said, and they don't plan. They just go toward the sound. I said that was what I'd seen. He said, so we just have to be quiet. I said that was the theory. He thought about that for a moment, and then said, Nora's going to find that really hard. Which was, I almost laughed. I almost actually laughed. And then I felt guilty about it. But it was true. Nora, who had been maintaining a moderately excellent silence level since the infected had come to the door, was at that moment making a very small sound with her mouth that was almost certainly the theme from a cartoon she'd been watching before all of this started. She didn't even know she was doing it. She always had some kind of noise running. Claire put her hand over Nora's mouth very gently, and Nora looked up at her and mimed a zipper across her lips. 7, 8, 9 years old. Kids adapt. You want to believe it's resilience. Sometimes I think it's just that they haven't built the mechanism yet to fully hold how bad something is. Day 9. Sunday. I found the other shelter. I wasn't looking for it. I was on the northeast part of the island, checking the lighthouse structure for the survey notes I'd taken last year. I wanted to know the structural condition of the floor in the lantern room, because I'd been thinking about using it as a watch post, when I found it on the way back. There's a section of the island, roughly in the middle, where the ground rises slightly, and there's a cluster of those stunted pitch pines that I mentioned. Maybe 8 or 10 trees, grouped together, their branches growing in the same direction, away from the prevailing wind. Under the trees, where the branches form a low canopy, someone had built a shelter. Not recently, not in the last few days, but not years ago either. Months, maybe. The construction was a frame of lashed branches covered with salvaged material, sections of tarp, some corrugated fiberglass, a sheet of plywood that had been hauled from somewhere. It was low, maybe 4 feet high, long enough to sleep 2 people. The entrance was partially screened with more tarp. Inside, a sleeping pad, flattened and dried from rain exposure. An old tin can, with some kind of dried food residue inside. A length of paracord coiled near the entrance. A coffee can that had been used as a latrine container, empty and cleaned. Nobody was here now, but somebody had been. I stood outside the shelter for a long time and looked around the trees and the surrounding grass. No recent footprints. The ground here was drier and held impressions poorly. No other signs of current occupation, but the shelter was used regularly. The sleeping pad, despite rain exposure, was positioned in a way that suggested repeated use. The cord was coiled neatly. This was a setup that someone returned to. I didn't touch anything. I went back to camp and told Claire. She said, "Someone else is on this island?" I said, "Probably not right now, but they'd been on it." She said, "Before the outbreak?" I said, "I didn't know when. It was hard to date." She said, "Or after, looking for shelter, like us." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Have they seen us?" And that was the question. The answer was, probably yes. If someone had been using this shelter before we arrived, they'd have seen us arrive. And if they'd come back after we set up camp, they'd seen our smoke and our lights and our rain collection system and all four of us. They'd seen us for a week, and they hadn't approached. Why hadn't they approached? I couldn't answer that in any direction that felt entirely comfortable. Day 10, Monday. I went out on the boat. I need to record the reasoning for this because it was a significant decision. The boat represents our only real exit option from the island. Using it for anything other than a potential emergency exit carries risk. Risk of damage, risk of mechanical failure, risk of being seen. But we needed information, and we needed to know what was around us. I'd been on this island for 10 days with almost no information about the larger situation. The radio gave me fragments. The view from the lighthouse gave me the mainland's fires. Neither gave me the local picture. There are 3 other islands within 5 miles of Harwick. 2 are smaller, barely more than rocks, and uninhabited in any meaningful sense. The third, Crail Island, is about twice the size of Harwick, has a small summer boat access area, and several seasonal cottages. I'd surveyed Crail once. I knew its layout. I waited until midday, when the light was best and the tide was favorable, and I told Claire where I was going and how long I expected to be gone. 2 hours maximum. Owen to run watch from the lighthouse lantern room during my absence. Claire and Nora to stay in the storage building. Claire didn't tell me not to go. She said come back. I went to Crail Island first. The approach told me things before I landed. 2 boats were tied to the Crail dock, both power boats, both appearing undamaged. Smoke, not fire, just wood smoke from a chimney, rising from one of the cottages. Signs of occupation. I came in slow and cut the engine well out from the dock and let the boat drift in, watching. No movement on the dock. I tied off and walked up the dock to shore. The cottages are arranged in a loose cluster above the small beach. 3 of them visible from the dock. One had the chimney smoke. The nearest cottage, a blue-painted structure, shutters painted white, had its front door standing open. I called out, "Nothing." Called again. A man came around from the side of the blue cottage. Older than me, maybe mid-50s, heavy-set, in a flannel shirt and rubber boots. He had a hand axe in his right hand, not raised, just held. He stopped when he saw me, and looked at me for a long moment. I said I was from Harwick Island. He said he knew. He'd seen my boat. I said there were 4 of us, my family. He said he knew that too. He'd seen us arrive. I didn't ask how long he'd been watching. I asked his name, he said Terry. I asked if he was alone. He paused, not long but long enough to notice, and then he said his wife was here, and 2 other people, a couple, who'd come out from the mainland about 4 days after us. I asked how they'd come. He said by boat, same as everyone. He said they'd seen the smoke and the fires and gotten out of the city. I asked how things were on the mainland. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Pretty bad. You don't want to go." I asked if he'd been. He said he'd made one run, 5 days ago, to get supplies from a marina store about 3 miles up the coast from the harbor. He said the marina was empty and the store was half looted. He said on the way back, he'd seen 3 of them on the dock, just standing on the dock. He said one of them went in the water when they heard the boat motor, and he didn't look back to see what happened. I asked if he'd heard anything. Military radio, any organized response. He shook his head slowly. Then he said, "There's a ship." I said what kind. He said he didn't know. He said you could see it some mornings at first light, sitting well offshore, maybe 8 or 10 miles. Big vessel. Navy, he thought. The profile was wrong for commercial. I hadn't seen it from Harwick. I filed that away. We talked for maybe another 20 minutes. His wife came out. A woman named Patricia, younger than him, thin-faced, watching me carefully. The other couple didn't come out. Before I left, Terry said something that stayed with me. He said, "How'd you know to go to the island before it got bad?" I said I'd seen some things on the radio, some patterns. He said, "We didn't know until it was on our street. We had maybe 2 hours." He wasn't accusing me of anything, but there was something in his tone, like he was just noting it, just putting it on the record. I went back to the boat and came home. I told Claire about Terry and Patricia and the others. I told her about the Navy vessel offshore. She asked what I thought that meant. I said it meant someone was still out there, watching, with resources. She asked why they weren't doing anything. I said I didn't know. Day 11, Tuesday. The mysterious shelter watcher presented itself more clearly today. Nora was playing near the south beach, within sight of the storage building, where Claire could see her. When she came running back, she ran inside and said there was a man watching from the water. I went out fast, boat hook ready. There was a small inflatable kayak, dark-colored, sitting in the water about 60 yards off the south beach. The person in it, a man, younger than me, wearing a dark jacket and a wool hat, was not paddling. He was sitting in the kayak and looking at the island, looking at me. We looked at each other across 60 yards of water. I raised my hand. Just a wave. Neutral. After a moment, he raised his hand back, and then he paddled away, going south and east, moving steadily until he disappeared around the south point of a small rock formation. He didn't come back. This was not someone who'd washed ashore. This was not someone who'd accidentally ended up here. This was someone who had deliberately approached the island, observed it, and then left when seen. He'd been watching us for, probably since we arrived. The shelter in the pitch pines, that was his. He'd been on this island before us, and he'd been watching us the whole time. The question was still why. I had 3 theories. 1. He was considering whether we were safe to approach, making sure we weren't going to be hostile, or sick, or a threat. 2. He was watching us for resources, figuring out what we had, planning to take it. 3. He was simply scared of other people, and watching from a distance was as close as he could bring himself to get. The first theory seemed most charitable, the second most paranoid. The third most plausible, maybe, given the world we were living in. He hadn't approached. He'd watched for 11 days and hadn't approached. I would wait him out. Day 12, Wednesday. I found his name before he told me. The shelter in the pitch pines. I went back to it, more carefully this time, and looked at everything. Under the sleeping pad, I found a small waterproof bag. I was going to leave it alone, but I opened it. Inside, a waterproof notebook, a lighter and 2 matches, 3 fishing hooks and a length of monofilament, a small folding knife, a photograph, laminated, of a woman and a boy. The woman young and dark-haired, the boy maybe 4 or 5 years old, smiling in front of what looked like a Christmas tree. And inside the front cover of the notebook, written in a careful hand, Liam Garrett, Quarry Point Road. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I put the notebook back under the pad. I left the shelter and walked back to camp. Liam, living out of a shelter on this island, watching us, with a photograph of a woman and a boy. My best guess was that they weren't here with him. I thought about that photo for most of the rest of the day. Day 13, Thursday. First serious food problem. Nora woke up with what Claire thought was a stomach bug. Cramping, nausea, no appetite. She lay on her sleeping bag in the inner room and didn't move much and didn't eat. We gave her water and one of the expired antihistamines to settle her stomach. Claire sat with her through the morning. By afternoon, she was better. Ate some broth. We'd started making broth from the canned goods, boiling it down and giving the liquid first and the solid second, which stretched the calories. By evening, she was sitting up and listing the things she missed. A game she'd started a few days ago, and that was both heartbreaking and weirdly useful. The list: Professor Ears, always number 1. Her friend Caitlin. Hot showers. The purple blanket from her bed. Macaroni from the good restaurant near the school. Her bike, TV. She paused and then she said, "Dad, do you think all the TV shows are stopped?" I said, "Probably for right now." She thought about this. Then she said, "That seems like a really big problem." Owen said, from the other side of the room where he was reading by flashlight, "Nora, you live on a private island in a zombie apocalypse and you're worried about TV." Nora said, "I'm allowed to miss things." Owen said, "Yeah, you are." Silence. Then Nora said, "Do you miss things?" Owen didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah." He didn't say what. Nora didn't push. I was pretending to read my own notes, but I wasn't reading anything. I was looking at the wall. Day 14. Friday. 2 weeks. I spent the morning fishing. This is something I should have been doing from the beginning, and I want to record the methodology because it matters for food planning. Harwick has 2 fishing locations that I've used during survey work. The North Dock, where there's a rocky shelf at about 15 feet depth, has good populations of black sea bass and tautog, both excellent eating. The west side of the Lighthouse Hill, where a submarine ledge drops quickly to deeper water, is good for striped bass when they're running, which at this time of year they sometimes are. I was using a hand line. I didn't have proper fishing tackle, but I found enough in the storage building debris and in what I'd brought, and Owen had brought a small spinning rod as part of his camping kit that he offered without being asked. I used the hand line from the North Dock with pieces of mussel I'd pried from the rocks as bait. In 3 hours I caught 7 fish, 2 tautog, a good size, and 5 smaller fish that I think were cunner, which are edible but bony. 7 fish, gutted and cleaned at the dock. The cleaning scraps I threw in the water away from the dock to avoid attracting anything near our main access point. Claire cooked the tautog with some onion powder and salt from our supplies, in a pan on the camp stove. The cunner she made into a sort of broth with canned vegetables. We had a meal that was as good as anything we'd eaten since arriving, maybe better because of what it represented. We'd gotten food from the island. We weren't just drawing down the stored supply, we'd added to it. Nora ate everything on her plate and said it was actually fine, which is her highest compliment for food she didn't initially expect to like. Owen ate in silence, but ate well. He asked after dinner if I'd teach him to handline. I said absolutely. After dinner, I went to the lighthouse lantern room and looked for the Navy ship Terry had mentioned. It was there, far offshore, much further than 8 or 10 miles, I thought. Maybe 15. A dark shape against the gray-blue water, sitting on the horizon, not moving that I could see. Running lights not visible in the failing light of early evening, which could mean they were dark running, or could mean the distance was too great. I watched it for a long time. It was real. It was there. An organized military asset sitting 15 miles offshore, while the mainland burned. Watching, or waiting. Day 15. Saturday. Liam came to the dock. I was sitting on a bench I'd rigged at the end of the dock. 2 boards across 2 oil drums I'd found, not comfortable but functional, with the hand line in the water. Not fishing with any urgency, just keeping the line down on the principle that it didn't cost anything to keep it there. Early morning. The water was flat. The kayak appeared from the south, moving along the island's western edge. Dark green, sit-on-top style, the kind kayak fishermen use. He paddled with short, economical strokes, not hurrying. He came alongside the dock and looked up at me. He was younger than I'd thought from the shore, late 20s, maybe 30 at most. Thin face, several weeks of beard, dark circles under his eyes. He had a weathered look that was distinct from just being dirty. It was the look of someone who'd been outside continuously for a long time. He said, "You've been here 2 weeks." I said, "You've been on this island longer than that." He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the water. Then he said, "I knew it before. The island. I used to come out here sometimes." I asked what for. He said, "No good reason. Just needed to be not on the land sometimes." I said, "Okay." He said, "I saw you the day you came. I was on the West Beach. I watched you dock." I asked why he hadn't approached. He took his time with that one. He said, 4 people coming to an island with a lot of gear, moving like they know exactly what they're doing. I didn't know who you were." I said, "We're a family. Surveyor, accountant, a 15-year-old, an 8-year-old. He said, I know, I figured that out. Still took me a while. He paused. People are different now, or maybe they were always like this, and it just shows now. I asked about his family. The woman in the photograph, the boy. He looked at me, then looked away. He said, I don't know. That was all he said about it. I invited him up to the dock. He tied the kayak and came up. I introduced myself. Garrett Holt. He said, Liam Beckett. I said, come up to camp and meet my family. He said, maybe in a while. He sat on the end of the dock and looked at the water, and I sat back on my bench, and we didn't talk for a long time, and it was actually fine. He'd been living in that shelter for going on 6 weeks, he told me eventually. He'd come out before the outbreak. He said he'd known something was coming, though not like this, not this specific thing. He'd worked for a city environmental health office, and he'd seen some internal reports about an outbreak of aggressive behavior among homeless populations in 2 different neighborhoods. He'd thought it was a drug thing. Synthetic opioids, bath salts, something that made people violent and insensible. He'd taken a week off and come out to the island because he needed to think. By the time the week was up, he said, he couldn't go back. He'd been here since. His food situation was poor. He'd run through what he'd brought and was living on fish and mussels and whatever the island produced, which wasn't much. He'd lost a significant amount of weight. He looked it. The thinness wasn't ranginess or fitness. It was depletion. I told him about the storage building and the civil defense cache. I told him about our food supply. I told him we'd been sharing, and he was welcome to eat with us. He said, you sure about that? I said no. I said I wasn't sure about anything right now. But we had enough, and he didn't. And I didn't like the idea of a person I could see from the camp starving to death in a pine tree shelter while we had 50-some days of food. He said, what do you want in return? I said I wanted to know everything he'd been observing from this island for the last 6 weeks. He said that was fair. Day 15, continued. Liam came up to camp around midday. I introduced him to Claire first, while the kids were occupied. She looked him over in that direct way she has, made a quick assessment, and said, you need a meal and a proper sleep. He said he was fine. She said, you're not fine. Sit down. He sat down. She gave him a bowl of the fish soup we'd made that morning and a portion of survival biscuits, and watched him eat with the neutral expression of someone taking a patient's pulse. When he'd finished, she said, when did you last sleep inside? He said 6 weeks. She said, okay. We'll sort the inner room. He said he didn't want to take their space. She said we'd sort it. When Owen came around the corner of the building and found a new person sitting at the camp table, he stopped and looked, doing his own quick assessment. Liam looked back at him. Owen said, you're the one who was in the kayak. Liam said, yeah. Owen said, I saw you from the lighthouse a few days ago, just watching. Liam said, yeah. Owen considered this. Then he said, okay, and came over and sat down across from Liam at the table. Nora came around after that, and her response was entirely different. She immediately asked Liam his name, his age, whether he had any kids, what his kayak was called, whether he'd seen any dolphins, and whether he thought sea glass was valuable. Liam answered each question in sequence, apparently without difficulty. He said his kayak was called, he thought about it, the wandering argument. Nora found this hilarious. She laughed her real laugh, the one that goes too loud before she remembers to be quiet. And then she covered her mouth and looked around with wide eyes, and then Liam almost smiled, the first time I'd seen that expression on his face. He stayed that night. Claire made up a sleeping pad for him in the corner of the inner room, and he lay down at 9 and was asleep in about 4 minutes. I sat outside the storage building for a while with the marine radio in my hand, running through channels, listening. There was new traffic, not the military voice I'd heard before, something else. A civilian voice, a woman, on a frequency that I almost passed. She was giving coordinates and repeating them, different coordinates each time, separated by short pauses. I didn't recognize the coordinates as specific points, but I wrote them down in the logbook margin. She repeated the set of coordinates 4 times, and then the signal was gone. I stared at the numbers for a while. They were coordinates, latitude and longitude in the standard notation. I needed a chart to know what they corresponded to. I had one on the boat. I brought charts for these waters as standard procedure. I went down to the dock and unrolled the chart under my flashlight. The coordinates were all in the offshore zone, 12 to 20 miles from the coast, spread over about 40 miles of coastline in a rough north-south line. They were meeting points, or safe zones, or supply points, something like that. The woman on the radio was either broadcasting locations for survivors to head to, or marking positions for something else. The Navy vessel offshore. I went back to the storage building and wrote the coordinates down properly, not in the margin, on a separate page. I thought about telling Liam in the morning. I decided yes. Day 17, Monday. I want to skip day 16 because nothing remarkable happened, and recording the unremarkable makes this feel like a list rather than a record. Day 16 was fishing, food inventory, weather observation, quiet. Nora found a piece of sea glass so large it looked like a door handle and carried it around for the rest of the day. Owen helped Liam repair the kayak's hull, where a slow crack had been weeping water. Claire reorganized our first aid supplies and gave me a quiet update on Nora's inhaler situation. 2 weeks remaining at current usage rate. 2 weeks of inhaler. That was a hard deadline. That was a problem. Day 17. I told Liam about the coordinates. He looked at the chart for a long time. He said, "This one," pointing to the third coordinate point, "that's roughly 15 to 16 miles from the harbor entrance. That's about where I've been seeing the ship." I said yes. He said, "What do you think is out there?" I said, "I thought there was an organized military or government presence offshore." I said, "They seem to be maintaining a strict perimeter, not going toward the coast, not making contact with the coast, just sitting and watching." I said the coordinates might be where they were distributing something, or where they were receiving something, or where they wanted survivors to go. He said, or where they were quarantining survivors before letting them anywhere near a ship. That hadn't occurred to me. I thought about it and decided it was plausible. He said, "We should go." I said it wasn't that simple. It was 15 miles of open water to reach a vessel we couldn't reach by radio and didn't know the disposition of. We had a family, including an 8-year-old and limited fuel. If we went and the ship was hostile or inaccessible, we'd burned fuel for nothing and possibly revealed our position. Liam said, "What's the alternative?" I said the alternative was staying here. We had food, water, shelter, a defensible position. The infected couldn't get here unless the tides delivered them, and we'd shown we could handle that. He said, "For how long?" I said, "As long as necessary." He said, "What's the end state? What does as long as necessary actually mean?" I didn't have a good answer. He said, "Because from where I'm standing, as long as necessary has a time limit called winter, and also a time limit called Nora's inhaler." He said this last part quietly, and I realized Claire had told him about the inhaler. I didn't mind. He needed to know the constraints to give useful input. I said I needed to make a trip to the mainland before anything else, get a better picture of what was actually there. Not into the city, into the coastal fringe, marina areas, somewhere I could get in and out quickly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go with you." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know," and left it there. Day 18, Tuesday. We went to the mainland. I want to record this day in as much detail as I can because it was the most information-rich day we'd had, and the most frightening. Left at 4 in the morning. Dark, no moon, which was deliberate. I wanted to approach the coast and whatever marina I was targeting without being visible. Liam in the bow, me at the helm. I'd told Claire where we were going and what time to expect us back. Owen had strict instructions to keep watch from the lighthouse lantern room from 6 a.m. and to have specific actions ready if we weren't back by noon. The coast came up after 45 minutes at a moderate speed. I'd been running without navigation lights, which was illegal and also sensible. As we closed the distance, the quality of the darkness changed. Instead of the pure black of the open water, the coast was a fractured dark, the shapes of trees and buildings against a sky that still had faint smoke haze, even at this hour. I made for a marina I knew, a small private operation about 4 miles north of the harbor entrance, a place I'd used for fuel on survey days, and knew had a store and some useful facilities. I came in at low speed with the engine barely above idle, listening. The approach was wrong immediately. The channel markers into the marina, 2 lighted buoys, were dark. Not just unlit, but missing. One of the marker poles was in the water, floating, detached from its mooring. I steered around it and came in on memory and tide feel, and the depth readings on my fish finder. The marina itself, 7 or 8 boats still in their slips, most of them undamaged, just sitting. The fuel dock was unattended. The store, which normally would have had a light on even at night for the security system, was dark. The parking lot visible from the water had 2 vehicles in it, both with doors open. I tied up at the fuel dock. Silence except for the water against the hulls. And under that, from inland, a sound, not constant, coming and going on the wind. Something that sounded like, I want to get this right, like a building site. Banging, scraping, irregular, but with an undertone that wasn't mechanical, organic, like a crowd, but wrong. Liam heard it too. He looked at me. I shook my head. Don't react. Listen. We listened for 5 minutes. The sound came from inland, maybe a mile. It wasn't getting closer. I fueled the boat first. The fuel dock was gravity-fed from above-ground tanks, and the pump was manual. I'd used it before, knew how it worked. I filled both boat tanks and all 4 5-gallon jugs we'd brought. Full. That was our primary reason for the trip. The store took 15 minutes. We moved fast and quiet. Liam stayed near the door while I worked the shelves, taking the most calorie-dense, lightest items first. Protein bars, nuts, dried fruit, peanut butter in the large jars. Then medical supplies from the small first aid section. Bandages, antiseptic, aspirin, ibuprofen. Then I hit the small pharmacy section, and my hands slowed because I was looking for what I needed most. Asthma inhaler. 2 Ventolin inhalers in a small locked pharmacy case at the back. I used my survey toolbag's pry bar on the case. I took the inhalers. I took 2 more that were a different brand but same medication, 4 inhalers total. Liam made a sound from the door, not words, a sound. I went to the door. 2 of them were in the parking lot, both walking toward the fuel dock, toward the boat, toward us. They'd heard something, or smelled something, or seen some movement. Moving at that pace, the middle pace, not the shamble but not the rush, the in-between gait that I'd learned meant they'd detected something, but hadn't fully locked on. They were about 40 yards away. Liam and I moved to the dock without running, smooth and controlled. I untied the bowline and Liam untied the stern, and I started the engine, and the engine noise brought them running, both of them, immediately, the lurch and faster pattern, coming for the sound. They reached the fuel dock end as I reversed out of the slip. One of them, a woman, I noted, in a yellow rain slicker, no shoes, both feet bleeding, kept coming, right off the dock end, into the water. Didn't stop, didn't hesitate, walked right off into the water and went under. The other one stood at the dock's edge and tracked the boat as I backed into the channel, just watching. Or not watching, orienting. Its head tracking the sound of the engine. I brought the bow around and went to open water and didn't look back. We were home by 10 in the morning. Claire was on the dock when we came in. She looked at us and looked at the boat and said, "Did you get it?" I said yes and held up the inhalers. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she started helping us unload. Day 19, Wednesday. Something happened last night that I need to record carefully. Liam was on watch. We'd established a rotating watch from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., 2-hour shifts, with the watcher sitting outside the storage building with the boat hook and the marine radio. His shift was midnight to 2. At around 1:30, he heard something at the north dock. He came and woke me without a word, just a hand on my shoulder, and when I opened my eyes, he pointed toward the north and held up 2 fingers. I got up and we went together to the north dock, moving slowly along the lighthouse hillside, where the terrain gave us concealment. There was a boat at the dock, not one of our boats. A small inflatable, a rigid inflatable boat, dark-colored, tied to the dock cleat with a practiced knot. Not a drifting vessel, deliberately tied. Nobody in the boat, nobody on the dock. Liam and I stood in the grass above the dock and listened. Wind from the northeast, water sounds, and then, from the direction of the keeper's house, a sound that was neither wind nor water. A moving sound, something inside the keeper's house. We moved to the keeper's house. I had the boat hook, and Liam had a length of timber he'd picked up. The front door of the keeper's house, which had been standing open since we arrived, was now closed. Not just pushed to, the handle was turned. Someone had closed it deliberately. I pushed the door open. There were 2 of them inside the keeper's house. People, living, breathing, deliberately moving people. A man and a woman, both crouched on the floor in the front room, both with flashlights pointed at the wall, going through. Nothing. There was nothing to go through in the keeper's house. They seemed to realize this. When I opened the door, they spun toward me, and the woman said something sharp and defensive, and the man raised his hands. They'd thought the keeper's house was the main shelter. They'd come looking for supplies and found an empty building. I said, slowly, that I didn't know who they were, and that they'd come to someone's island. I said my family was here. The man said he was mid-40s, short, narrow-faced, wearing a good-quality waterproof jacket. He said they hadn't known anyone was here. He said they'd seen the island from the water and thought it was empty. I said the storage building behind the lighthouse had smoke from the stovepipe. I said it would have been visible from the water. He said they'd come in on the east side of the island. They hadn't seen the stovepipe from that angle. Possible. Marginally. His name was Douglas. His companion was a woman named Beth, younger by maybe 15 years, with the look of someone who'd been functioning on adrenaline for weeks. She was calm in the way that people are calm when they've burned through all their initial panic and come out the other side. Not peace. Exhaustion. They'd come from a settlement on the coast, not the city, further north. A small town where a group had been holding together in a school building. Douglas said the school situation had been working until about a week ago, when the horde drew close enough to the building that the noise and the movement became unsustainable. People started arguing about what to do. A faction wanted to break for vehicles and run inland. Another wanted to stay. A third, Douglas's group, wanted to try the water. He said about 12 people had gone in the water group. They had 3 boats. They'd lost 1 boat in a night accident on an offshore bar. Nobody drowned, but the boat was finished, and the 6 people in it had crowded into the remaining 2. The crowded boats had problems. One engine failed, and the working boat towed it for a while and then couldn't. And the engine-failed boat went to an island Douglas didn't know the name of. He pointed southeast, which would have been Crail. He and Beth had continued north in the last working boat, looking for supplies. I thought about the 4 people on Crail, Terry and Patricia, and the couple whose names I didn't know. I thought about 6 more people showing up with a dead boat, looking for resources. I said there were already people on Crail Island, and that the situation there was probably not open to more arrivals. I said this island was ours. Douglas said they understood. I said there was another, smaller island to the south, that was rough, but might work for temporary shelter. He said, "We're not looking to move in. We're looking for fuel and food." I said I couldn't give fuel. I said I could give some food. Beth, who hadn't said anything yet, said, "We have medical supplies, if that's useful for a trade." I looked at her. "What kind?" She said, "Antibiotics. Real ones. Prescription. From the school nurse's office. A lot of them." I asked what she wanted in exchange. She said enough food for a week, and information about what was around here. I told Liam to go get Claire. Day 20. Thursday. Douglas and Beth spent the night on the dock in their inflatable. I wasn't ready to bring them into the storage building yet. Not with the kids there. Not with people I'd just met. I gave them food and water. In the morning we talked properly. The antibiotics they had. I won't go into the full list. because it doesn't mean much without context, but it included amoxicillin, azithromycin, and a supply of doxycycline that was substantial. Doxycycline has a range of uses beyond typical infection treatment. In the storage building's civil defense first aid supplies, I had some antibiotics already, but having prescription strength supply, was meaningful. In exchange, I gave them a week's worth of food, canned goods and survival biscuits and some dried fish that I'd started preparing as a shelf-stable supplement. The information exchange was the more valuable part. Douglas had been in the coastal community for 3 weeks before it broke down. In that time, he'd been in radio contact with several other groups. Not two-way radio exactly, but receiving broadcasts. He told me about a settlement north of us, about 40 miles up the coast, that had taken over a coastal resort and was apparently functioning with some organization. He told me about a signal he'd been receiving from offshore. He confirmed the Navy vessel. He said he'd been receiving snippets of organized communication that suggested a larger vessel, possibly multiple vessels, maintaining station offshore. And then he told me about something else. He said there was another island group, not Terry's group on Crail. Different, maybe 12 to 15 miles east of Harwick, on the outer edge of the island chain, a cluster of small islands called the Ledge Islands that were barely on the charts because they were so small and so exposed. He said some of his people at the school had picked up radio traffic from that direction before the school situation fell apart. Not the official station. Civilian radio, multiple voices, organized sounding. A group. He didn't know how many or who, but there was a group on the Ledge Islands. I looked at the chart after he and Beth left. The Ledge Islands, 3 or 4 small outcroppings, the largest maybe 2 acres. Exposed, barely above sea level at high water. Terrible place to be in any kind of weather, but far enough offshore that no tides were going to deliver infected passengers to their doorstep. And with radio communications. Sat with the chart for a long time. Day 21, Friday, 3 weeks. I had a conversation with Owen that night that I want to get down accurately. He'd been quieter than usual for a few days, and I'd been putting off asking because I wasn't sure I had the bandwidth to handle whatever was underneath the quiet. That's an honest thing to say, and not a good one. He came to me after Nora was asleep and said he needed to talk. We went outside and sat on the big flat rock near the Lighthouse Hill base. He said he'd been reading the logbook, not the civil defense one, this logbook, the pages I'd been writing in. I'd left it out. I hadn't thought to put it away, and he'd read it. He said, "You think we might be here for the rest of our lives?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I thought there were people out there, like the offshore vessel, like the group on the Ledge Islands, who were trying to rebuild something. I said I didn't think this was permanent. He said, "But you don't know that." I said no, I didn't know that. He was quiet for a while. The water was making its sounds. A cormorant went over in the dark, its wing beats a rapid dry flutter. Then Owen said, "Dad, when you decided to come here, before anything happened, did you know?" I said I had a feeling, a pattern reading. I said I wasn't sure. He said, "But you were sure enough to bring us." I said yes. He said, "And you didn't tell anyone else?" I said no. He sat with that for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, the tone of someone who has already had this argument in their head multiple times and has worn it smooth. He said, "I'm not angry at you. I want to say that first. I'm not. But I want to know, did you think about telling other people?" I said yes. He said, "But you didn't." I said no. He said, "Why not?" I told him the truth, which I hadn't fully said out loud before. I said I wasn't certain. I said if I'd been certain, I would have told people. But I was only partially certain, and to tell people means telling them something specific. And if I was wrong, I'd have caused panic for nothing. And if I tried to tell everyone, I'd have delayed getting us out. Owen said, "So you chose us?" I said yes. He nodded slowly. He looked at the water. Then he said, "Good." Just that, good. I didn't know what to say back. We sat there for a while, and then he said he was cold and went inside. And I sat on that rock for another half hour in the cold and thought about what choosing us had meant for every neighbor on our street who hadn't gotten a note on their door. Day 22, Saturday. The weather broke. A system came through that I'd been watching build on the horizon for 2 days. A proper Atlantic late-season storm. Not catastrophic, but substantial. 35-knot winds, gusting to 45. Rain that came in sheets, and then came in bands, and then came in sheets again. The water around the island went from flat to rough in about 6 hours, and by midday, the South Beach was entirely under breaking surf. This was the first major weather test for the storage building shelter. The patched roof held. The canvas section I'd stretched over the largest hole leaked in the heaviest gusts, but only a trickle, and the buckets I'd positioned caught it. The main doors held against the wind. The timber brace from inside and the exterior latch together were solid. The rain collection system worked better than it had any right to. I'd positioned a collection barrel under the main downspout feed, and by late afternoon it was full. Liam had gotten his inflatable kayak up to the storage building that morning, upturned against the south wall as shelter for the boat. He'd been living in the storage building with us since that first night he'd slept in the inner room, by unspoken arrangement rather than formal invitation. He didn't take up much space. He was useful. He'd started fishing from the North Rocks in the early morning before anyone else was up, using his own handline, and he'd been quietly supplementing our fish supply for days. The storm gave us a day inside together. Nora, who had been restless and subdued in equal measure, seemed to relax when the storm gave her a reason to stay put. She drew pictures on sheets of paper I'd found in the debris pile, old survey records that were printed on one side and blank on the other. She drew pictures of the island, of the lighthouse, of Professor Ears, who she rendered from memory with impressive accuracy, of what she called our new house. She gave the drawing of our house to Claire, who folded it carefully and put it in the inner room. Owen and Liam played cards. Owen had a deck in his camping bag, worn but complete. They taught each other games, and Liam taught Owen something that might have been a variant of gin, and might have been something Liam made up. The rules seemed to evolve over several hands. Owen didn't mind. He laughed more that day than he had in weeks. Real laughing, not polite laughing. Claire sat next to me while the rain hammered the corrugated roof and we listened to the storm, and she said, very quietly, "I'm okay, you know. I need you to know that." I said I knew. She said, "I don't think you do. I think you're watching all three of us for signs of cracking, and I want you to redirect that energy." I said, "Toward what?" She said, "Toward yourself." I started to say I was fine. She put her hand over my mouth before I finished the word. She said, "Don't. I know you. I've known you for 18 years. What does the crack in you look like right now?" I thought about it. I said it looked like lying awake at 3 in the morning thinking about the neighbors. It looked like running the names of people I could have called. She said, "You saved us." I said I knew. She said, "And that's not enough." I said no. She moved closer to me and didn't say anything else. Outside, the storm was doing everything it does. Day 23, Sunday. The storm aftermath. After it cleared, I walked the island to assess damage. The lighthouse hill path had eroded at one section, where a small drainage gully had been cut by the runoff. Manageable. The north dock had lost one of its outer planks, which had been held only by old corroded screws, and the fender piles had shifted. The storage building was fine. The keeper's house had lost a section of roof on the northeast corner. More of the same deterioration that had been going on for decades. Nothing we'd caused. The South Beach. 6 of them were on the South Beach. I saw it from the lighthouse hill, and I stood very still for a moment, and then went back down and got Liam. 6 infected, all arrived on the storm-driven tide, spread along the length of the South Beach, not grouped together, separate, some distance between them, each having washed up at different points. 4 of them were not moving, lying on the gravel in the positions that things lie in when they're done. 2 were moving, that slow tidal drift of motion, pulling themselves up the beach with the kind of purpose that wasn't purpose, just signal following, seeking ground, the way water seeks the lowest point. The two moving ones were headed for the island's interior. Liam and I handled this. I won't write the details of it at length. I'll say that the boat hook is 12 feet long, and the two moving infected were far enough apart that we could take them separately. I'll say that Liam knew what to do without discussion. I'll say it took about 4 minutes, and afterward we stood at the South Beach, and I feel, and then I don't feel, and the not feeling is the thing I've learned to manage, rather than try to understand. The 4 that weren't moving, 3 were clearly past all recovery. 1, the 4th one, on the far left end of the beach, was ambiguous, in the same way the man in the skiff had been. Occasional movement, not purposeful, not going anywhere. I waited at the beach until the tide came in, and resolved that. Then I went back to camp and told Claire we'd had some arrivals and we'd handled it, and the situation was clear. She asked if we were okay. I said we were okay. Liam went down to the kayak and paddled around the south point, and didn't come back for a couple of hours. When he came back, he didn't say where he'd been, and I didn't ask. Day 24, Monday. I need to write about the photograph. Liam's photograph. The woman and the boy in front of the Christmas tree. I'd seen it in his waterproof bag when I'd gone through his shelter, and I hadn't asked him about it beyond the first day when he'd said, "I don't know," and I'd left it. He brought it up himself. We were fishing off the north dock in the early morning, both with hand lines down, not talking much. He said, "Her name is Colleen. The boy is Patrick. He was 6 in that photo. He's probably 7 now. If. I said, "She know where you were? Before all this?" He said she knew he came to the island sometimes. He said he said it like he was choosing the word carefully. Separated. Not legally, just separated. I said, "You want to find out what happened to them?" He said, "I want to go back and find them." Or, he stopped. I said, "What's stopping you?" He said, "The mainland. I know what's there." I said, "You don't know specifically." He said, "No, I don't know specifically." We fished for a while. Then I said, "After we deal with the medical situation and the supply situation and figure out what's on those ledge islands, we talk about the mainland, a targeted run, not general scavenging, a specific address." He looked at me. I said, "I'm not promising anything. I'm saying we talk about it." He nodded. He looked at his line in the water. Then he said, "Garrett." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Thank you." I said I hadn't done anything yet. He said, "Yeah, you have." Day 26, Wednesday. Something I need to record because it doesn't fit anywhere else. I've been keeping the logbook here partly because writing helps me think. But there's another reason I've been documenting everything this carefully, and it's that when I'm reading the old lighthouse keeper's entries in the front of this book, the ones that go back to 1887, faded brown ink in a careful hand, I notice that he did the same thing. Keeper Aldous Hartwell, who tended this light from 1887 to 1912, wrote about the weather and the ships and the comings and goings, with the same slightly too careful specificity of a man who needed to make the days feel real by putting them into words. His last entry before he was replaced reads, 6 November 1912. Wind NE 18, visibility moderate, no vessels in the channel, station in good order. That's it, station in good order, and then nothing more from Hartwell, just the next keeper picking up the dates. I wonder what happened to him after the lighthouse. I wonder if he missed it. Station in good order. Day 27, Thursday. I went to the Ledge Islands. This was a decision I'd been building toward since Douglas mentioned them, and the timing was pushed by 2 factors. The forecast was giving me a 3-day window of calm, workable weather, and the Civil Defense radio had pulled in that same woman's voice again the night before, broadcasting the offshore coordinates, and this time I'd caught something else, a different voice, male, giving a response at the end of the broadcast, saying coordinates in return that, when I charted them, fell in the middle of what I estimated as the Ledge Islands group. There was active radio communication coming from the Ledge Islands, aimed at the offshore vessel. Liam came with me again. Claire knew. Owen had watch duty. Nora was making sea glass art under Claire's supervision and had been told, honestly, that we were going to look at a nearby island for resources and would be back for dinner. It was a 12-mile run south and east. The outer water, away from the coast, in the island chain's outer reaches, was different from the water near Harwick. Deeper blue-green, longer swells, more settled, less complicated by the tidal interactions of the mainland coast. I'd surveyed out here once, years ago, checking the Ledge Islands' erosion for an academic study. I knew the water well enough. The Ledge Islands appeared first as dark spots on the water, then as a low spread of rocky ground barely above the swell. There were 4 main islands, if you could call them that. The largest, maybe 2 acres, was the only one that had any real height, a central ridge maybe 20 feet above sea level. The others were flat rock with some grass, and one stunted tree on the second largest. As we approached, I saw structures on the largest island. Not natural. Something had been built, low constructions of salvaged material, partially hidden against the island's ridge. I cut the speed down and came in slowly and let the boat drift. A voice on the radio, our radio, channel 14, which was not a channel I'd been monitoring. White Pathfinder, you're approaching the ledge. Please identify. I picked up the radio. I gave our names, Garrett Holt, Liam Beckett. I said we were from Harwick Island, 9 miles northwest. I said we weren't infected, weren't armed, we're looking for information. A pause. Then, maintain your position. We'll come to you. 2 minutes. Then a kayak appeared from the largest island's lee side, paddled by a figure in a dry suit, moving efficiently. The kayak came alongside, and the paddler lifted her visor. Young woman, 20s, freckled, her hair in a practical braid that had mostly come undone, a headset around her neck. She was wearing a dry suit that was high quality, serious equipment, the kind you buy when you know what you're doing on the water. She looked at us without expression for a moment. Then she said, "Garrett Holt, are you the marine surveyor who was doing erosion assessments for the state 3 years ago?" I said yes. She said, "I was the ecology grad student who gave you access to the Barrier Spit site. My name is Nadia. You probably don't remember me." I remembered, not her face, but the arrangement. A PhD student who'd been doing salt marsh monitoring on the same barrier spit I was assessing. We'd worked adjacent to each other for 2 days without much direct interaction. I remembered she'd had very organized data notebooks. I said, "You're with a group." She said, 17 people, originally 23. We've been here 42 days. She said it without weight, just fact. 6 people in 42 days was a number that landed on you from the inside after you heard it. She'd had time to package it. She said, "Come ashore. Carefully on the east approach, the rock is slippery." Day 27, continued. The Ledge Islands group was not what I'd expected. I'd expected improvised survival, people hanging on. And there was some of that. You could see it in the resource management, in the way the structures were functional rather than comfortable, in the gauntness of some of the people who came out to look at us when we landed. But there was also organization. Real organization. The kind that someone had designed and implemented rather than arrived at by accident. Nadia had a background in ecology and environmental systems, and she'd applied that framework to survival logistics with the precision that I recognized from her data notebooks. The Ledge Islands group had established a rainwater collection system more sophisticated than mine. They had a cold smoking setup for fish preservation, using a barrel they'd salvaged from a passing debris field. They had a dedicated watch rotation, logged in a binder. They had a medical officer, a woman named Dr. Harriet Page, 60s, who'd been a coastal emergency physician and whose boat had broken down near the ledges on day 3. And they had a radio, a proper one, not civil defense era, not marine band handset, a single sideband transceiver they'd salvaged from one of the derelict boats that had drifted close enough to board. It required power they generated from a bicycle-mounted generator that one of the group members pedaled for 30 minutes each evening. With it, they'd established what Nadia called a fragile but functional, two-way communication link with the offshore vessel. The offshore vessel was a U.S. Navy destroyer, USS Connolly. It had been offshore since day 3 of the outbreak, maintaining its perimeter as part of what Nadia understood to be a classified containment and observation protocol. She'd spoken to their communications officer twice. The Connolly was not permitted to land parties on the mainland, and not permitted to transport survivors to naval facilities without a clearance process that required medical certification, which required testing equipment they didn't have offshore. But the Connolly had a drone, a small UAV, which they'd used twice to drop supply packages to groups the crew had identified as worth maintaining. The coordinates that the woman on the radio had been broadcasting, those were the drop coordinates, 12 to 16 miles offshore, where the Connolly could reach them with the UAV. The Ledge Islands group had received one package. Inside, a satellite phone, 3 days of use remaining on its battery, a handwritten note from the Connolly's CO that said, "Hold your position. We are working on resolution. Civilian transport vessels expected within 30 to 60 days. Keep this channel clear." 30 to 60 days from when? The note was undated. Nadia thought it had come about 12 days ago, which would make the window 18 to 48 days from now. She wasn't certain. Hold your position. Civilian transport vessels. I stood in the low structure that served as the Ledge Islands group's communications room, essentially a covered area on the island's ridge with the SSB radio and the bicycle generator and a small desk made from a door, and I looked at the handwritten note and I read it twice. Resolution. That was the word. We are working on resolution. I didn't ask what resolution meant, specifically. I don't think anyone knew, specifically. I think it was a word that covered a range of possibilities, and nobody wanted to narrow it down. I asked Nadia what she thought. She said, "I think they're trying to figure out whether this is contained or whether it's the whole coast. And I think the honest answer is, it's not contained. And I think they're building toward a plan where the offshore areas become the start of whatever comes next." I said islands. She said, islands, coastal platforms. Anything that's naturally quarantinable. They can't do anything with the mainland right now, and maybe for a long time, but they can protect and support isolated communities that have proven themselves infection-free. I said, "How do you prove yourself?" She said, "You stay isolated. You don't bring anyone from the mainland aboard without a quarantine period. You document everyone in your group and their health status over time." She paused. "You're already doing that. You've been on Harwick for what, 4 weeks? With no new infections? That's better than most." I asked about the Crail Island group. She knew about them. She'd been in radio contact. She said Terry's group had one member who'd come from the mainland after day 10, and she wasn't sure about the quarantine protocols there. I thought about that. I told her about Liam's family. She said she was sorry. She said there were going to be a lot of those, people with family on the mainland. I asked if anyone had attempted the mainland. She said 2 of her group had gone, early on. The first one came back fine, came back with supplies, and a story about the coastal fringe being largely clear if you stayed out of the city and moved fast. The second one went 8 days later and didn't come back. Nobody went after that. Day 28, Friday. I told the family about the Connolly. All of it, including the 30 to 60 days timeline that was already partially elapsed, and therefore 18 to 48 days from yesterday. I showed them the note. Nadia had given me a copy in her handwriting. I laid out what I understood. The Navy was offshore. They knew about isolated coastal groups. They were working toward some kind of transport and resettlement process, and the Ledge Islands group was the most established link to that process. Owen asked the most direct question first. What do they mean by resolution? I said I didn't know exactly. I said I thought it meant establishing secure land-based facilities away from the infected zones, probably inland, possibly on verified clear coastal areas, possibly offshore installations. I said I thought the offshore islands were going to be staging points for whatever came next. He said, "So staying here is actually the right thing." I said yes. He said, "How sure are you?" I said 60-40. 60 for staying, 40 for something goes wrong, and we need a different plan. He said, "That's not very sure." I said no. Nora had been quiet through this. She said, "What about Professor Ears?" Claire said. What, sweetheart? Nora said, if we go to a new place, do you think Professor Ears is okay at home, or do you think something happened? There was a silence where I could feel everyone carefully not looking at each other. Liam said, very gently, I bet he found a good spot. Rabbits are good at finding spots. Nora looked at him. He's not a real rabbit. He's stuffed. Liam said, stuffed rabbits are the best at finding spots. They don't have to worry about food. Nora thought about this seriously. Then she said, that's actually true, and seemed to settle. Liam caught my eye for a moment and looked away. 8 years old, sitting in a concrete room on a tiny island, and she'd just given herself permission to believe the rabbit was okay. Skill. Day 31. Monday. Something happened that I wasn't expecting. Terry came to Harwick. He came by boat in the early afternoon, alone, without Patricia or the others from Crail. He tied up at our dock and came up to the storage building, and I could see immediately that something was wrong. He looked worse than when I'd last seen him, thinner, the color off. He sat down and I got him water and he said, I need to tell you something. I said, go ahead. He said, we had a problem on Crail. One of the people who came in the second week, the ones from the failed boat, the 6 who came from Douglas's group, one of them was bitten. I said, when? He said, before they arrived. They knew, he said. The man knew, and his partner knew, and they hadn't said anything for 3 days. They'd thought it might not be what it was. They'd hoped. On day 3 on Crail, the man had turned. Terry stopped talking for a moment. Then he said it had happened in the night, and they'd lost one of the others before they dealt with it. A woman named Linda, who'd been in the second boat. She was 62 years old, and she'd been a middle school science teacher. He said he'd contained the situation. He said everyone else on Crail was alive and uninfected. He said he'd quarantined the partner, the man's girlfriend, for 10 days and she'd been clear. But the group on Crail was fractured now. 2 people had taken a boat and left for somewhere else, which left Terry and Patricia and 5 others. He said, we need to know what you know about the offshore situation. We need to make some decisions. I told him about the Connolly, about Nadia's group on the Ledge Islands, about the timeline. He listened. He looked at his hands. He said, 18 to 48 days. I said minimum. Could be longer. He said, that's a long time to hold together when things are falling apart. I said I knew. He said, I want to consolidate. Bring my people here, or I'll go to the Ledge Islands. Something. Crail isn't. He stopped. Crail isn't the right situation anymore. I thought about this. I thought about what adding 7 people to our island would mean for food, for space, for dynamics. I thought about what it would mean not to. I thought about what saying no to 7 people felt like, on the scale of the world we were in. I said we'd need to talk about it, not just Claire and I, Liam, and the Ledge Islands group, and Terry's people, everyone together, a decision made together, with full information. Terry said, when? I said 2 days. Give me 2 days to organize it. Day 33, Wednesday. We held a meeting. Harwick Island's lighthouse grounds, noon, clear weather, low wind. Everybody who'd come, Terry and Patricia and 4 of their Crail group, Nadia in her kayak from the Ledge Islands with 2 others. Our group, me, Claire, Owen, Nora, Liam. 19 people, standing on a 4-acre island in the Atlantic. I'll be honest, standing there with all of them, I felt the weight of it. Not in a dramatic way, just 19 people who'd all made a series of decisions that happened to keep them alive, and now all those decisions had intersected on this piece of ground, and the next series of decisions mattered enormously. I let Nadia lead most of the discussion. She had the best information and the best analytical mind, and she'd had this conversation internally with her own group already. She walked everyone through what she knew about the Connolly, about the offshore coordinates, about the expected transport timeline. She said the Ledge Islands group had made contact with the Connolly again 2 days ago. Updated timeline. Transport operation expected within 25 days. Not civilians. A Navy-coordinated civilian vessel, a former ferry that had been operating up the coast, moving survivor groups from verified clean offshore platforms to a larger facility on an island about 90 miles north. 25 days. She said the Connolly needed verified group manifests, everyone's name, health status documented over time, any medical conditions. She said they needed proof of quarantine, no new arrivals from the mainland in the last 14 days minimum. She said groups that had that documentation would be prioritized for transport. I had the logbook. Every person who'd set foot on Harwick Island since day one was documented in this book. Terry's group had a problem. One member of the Crail group had arrived from the mainland within the quarantine window, having left the mainland 8 days ago. He was healthy and showing no signs, but he fell inside the 14-day window. Nadia said, "We wait. 6 more days and he's clear." Terry said, "What if something comes up in 6 days?" Nadia said, "That's the risk. But we document everything, and we wait the 6 days. If we don't have clean documentation, we don't get on the transport." The harder question was whether to consolidate. 19 people on Harwick was viable, but uncomfortable. The ledge islands could hold everyone, but were extremely exposed in any weather. Splitting the group across 2 locations created communication and coordination problems. We talked through it for 2 hours. Nobody shouted, nobody broke down. People disagreed, and then found the middle, and then disagreed again, and found another middle. Claire did a lot of the facilitation. She's good at that. Her accountant's brain moving between the columns and finding where numbers could reconcile. The decision: keep Harwick as the primary base. Nadia's radio group would stay on the ledge islands for communication continuity. They were the link to the Connolly, and moving the radio equipment was risky. Terry's group would come to Harwick. The 6 days of quarantine wait for the newest member would run on Harwick under observation. Then clean manifests, then contact the Connolly through Nadia's group, then wait for the transport window. Simple enough as a plan. Simple never stays simple. Day 35, Friday. We had 21 people on Harwick by the end of the day. Terry's group came over in 3 loads in my Pathfinder, and Terry's own boat. The storage building was genuinely crowded now. We opened up the main section fully and used the inner room as sleeping quarters for the smallest family units. Some of the adults were sleeping in the keeper's house, which I'd never fully trusted, but which was structurally okay for dry weather use. Food was the immediate pressure. I ran the numbers with Claire that evening. With 21 people at the Harwick supply base and normal consumption, the 57-day surplus I'd calculated for our family of 4 collapsed to something more like 12 days at adequate calories, which meant we needed more food. Fast. I organized 2 fishing teams, me and Owen from the North Dock with handlines, Liam and a man from Terry's group named Walter, who'd been a commercial fisherman for 20 years, working the lighthouse hill ledge with proper equipment that Walter had on his boat. We fished hard for 2 days. Walter knew what he was doing in a way that made my modest fishing feel like a hobby. He rigged an improvised long line with hooks baited from the mussels and periwinkles he harvested from the rocks, and laid it in the channel, and pulled it in the evening. 32 fish in 2 days. Tautog, sea bass, some type of flounder that Walter identified with certainty, and I couldn't have named. Plus mussels in quantity, harvested and steamed. It wasn't enough. Not for 21 people for 12 days. Not close. But it was more than nothing. I started thinking about a mainland supply run. A serious one, not a fuel stop. A proper resupply mission. Walter's boat was faster than mine and had better range. If we targeted the right location, not the city, not anywhere near the infected centers, but a coastal marine supply depot or a commercial fishing facility, we could potentially bring back enough to bridge the gap. Terry, who was the other person with real water experience, said he knew of a marine equipment depot about 12 miles north of us. They supplied fishing operations, cold storage, canning equipment, large quantities of preserved food. He'd dealt with them for years. He said on a normal day in the fall they'd have pallets of canned and smoked product ready for shipping. He said, "I know the building layout. I could go in and out fast." I said I wanted to see the approach before we committed. We planned it for the following morning. Day 36, Saturday. We went at dawn. Terry, Walter, and me in Walter's boat. The marine depot was north of the marina I'd raided on day 18, at the end of a working waterfront that served the commercial fishing fleet. The waterfront was a long concrete dock structure with warehousing behind it. Most of it was dark and silent when we came in. One building had a door standing open. We docked at the commercial pier. The pier was empty. No boats working. No workers. The smell from the open building was cold and mechanical, and the specific smell of fish processing, which at this quantity was very strong. Inside the open building, the canning and packaging operation, large equipment, most of it industrial scale, and on steel pallets along the back wall, cases of processed canned fish product, labeled for commercial distribution, smoked bluefish, canned chowder base, salted cod, whole pack canned tuna. There was enough here to feed a small army for weeks. We worked for 90 minutes loading Walter's boat. We couldn't take it all. Walter's boat has a load limit and I wasn't going to risk swamping it. But we took what we could. 6 pallets of mixed product, carefully stacked and distributed for stable loading. Terry found a supply room at the back of the facility that held other goods, cleaning supplies, useful, first aid materials, including a significant amount of wound closure supplies, very useful. A case of sealed water purification tablets, excellent. Work gloves in various sizes, waterproof clothing. We took all of it. One infected in the facility. Only one, which was less than I'd feared. It was in the cold storage area at the far end. Must have gotten inside somehow and been in there since, moving in slow loops around the refrigerated space. Cold slows them, apparently. It was very slow. We went around it and left it in there, and closed the cold storage door. I don't know whether that was the right call. I spent some time thinking about it on the way back. 45 minutes back to Harwick. We arrived to the most enthusiastic reception I'd experienced since this started. People on the dock, lifting boxes, the energy of a group that has just had its most pressing problem addressed. Walter was grinning, the first time I'd seen him smile, a wide gap-toothed expression that transformed his weathered face. Claire counted the cases. She revised her supply estimate. New timeline, 22 days at adequate consumption, 27 if they rationed to 80%. We had 20 days to the start of the transport window. We were going to make it. Day 38, Monday. The quarantine period for Michael, the newest arrival, the one who'd come from the mainland 8 days ago, was up today. Nadia's criteria met. I documented it in the logbook. Day 38. Michael Hartley. Arrived Crail Island from mainland day 30. No symptoms over 14-day period. Health status? Clear. I radioed that to Nadia. She passed it through to the Connolly. The Connolly's response came back in 2 hours. Harwick Island Group. Manifest received. Current transport schedule. T plus 18 days from now. Primary rendezvous point. Ledge Islands Station. All groups to consolidate at Ledge Islands, no earlier than T plus 14. Confirm receipt. 18 days. I read it out to the group that evening. Gathered in the storage building and the keeper's house and the area between. When I read the number, someone at the back of the group, I couldn't see who, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. An exhale. A release. Owen came and stood next to me and said nothing. Nora reached for my hand. Liam stood at the edge of the group, slightly apart, and looked at the ground. I thought about what I'd promised him. A conversation about the mainland. A targeted run to a specific address. I hadn't forgotten. Day 39. Tuesday. I told Liam that if we were going to do it, it had to be now. Before the consolidation to the Ledge Islands. Before we moved everyone and started the final window. He knew. He'd been waiting. He had the address on Quarry Point Road. 14 miles up the coast, about 3 miles inland from the harbor. A residential street. We planned it like the supply run. Boat to a landing point well clear of the harbor. Inland by foot. 3 miles. Which in contaminated territory was not a short distance. Move fast. Move quiet. Hit the address. Come back. The risks. We'd be covering ground on foot, which we hadn't done. We'd be deeper inland than any of our previous excursions. The harbor area was the most infected zone on the coast. Getting 3 miles inland without cutting through or past it Would require a route that added time. Claire said, "When?" I said, "Tomorrow, before dawn." She said, "Come back." I said I would. She said, "I mean it." I said, "I know." That night, for the first time in a long time, I really didn't sleep at all. Not the half-sleep, not the troubled rest. I lay in the inner room and listened to everyone else's breathing. 17 people distributed between this room and the keeper's house and the storage building main space. And I thought about the route to Quarry Point Road, and I went through it again and again, and tried to find where it went wrong. Day 40, Wednesday. Left at 3:30 in the morning. The night crossing was 20 minutes. We landed at a small boat ramp about 4 miles north of the harbor, a recreational launch site that I'd checked on our previous run. Empty. No sign of recent infected activity, the parking lot gate standing open where it had been forced. We pulled the boat up the ramp and I anchored it short against the ramp's end with 2 lines, and we went inland. The 3 miles to Quarry Point Road took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The coastal fringe was eerie, in a way that is hard to fully put down in words. Not empty. Things moved. Birds, startled. A cat, impossibly, sitting on a fence post watching us with a cat's absolute disregard for the apocalypse, then dropping from the post and vanishing. Small animals in the brush. The sounds of damage and decay. A building somewhere ahead of us that had partially collapsed made a slow groaning sound as we passed. Glass underfoot that I'd been unable to see and stepped on, and the noise of it stopping both of us cold for 30 seconds while we listened. No infected on the coastal route we were taking. One, far off to our left as we cut through a residential neighborhood, a figure in a backyard, moving along the fence line, not tracking us. We gave it a wide berth and kept going. The smell of the city changed the further inland we went. Not the chemical smoke smell I'd imagined. More organic than that. Like decay, yes, but also something damp and fungal. The smell of things left in rain. Buildings that had been closed up and then open to weather. Gardens going back to whatever they'd been before they were gardens. Quarry Point Road was a mid-century residential street. 2-story houses, detached, set back from the road with small front yards. The kind of street where kids ride bikes and people know each other's names. In the gray pre-dawn, it looked like every street in every city. Ordinary and permanent. Liam was ahead of me, and then he stopped walking. He stood still in the middle of the road. The house he was looking at, number 48, I counted later, had its front door closed. Curtains drawn in the ground floor windows. The lawn had gotten long in the way lawns get without anyone cutting them. Maybe 6 weeks of growth. A child's bicycle on the front path, on its side, 1 wheel still. He stood there for a long time. I didn't say anything. Then he walked to the front door. He had a key. He'd been carrying the key for 40 days. He put it in the lock, and the door opened, and we went inside. It was a house. It was a family's house. I felt immediately that I was somewhere private, and I stayed near the door while Liam moved through the rooms. The house was empty. Not ransacked, not damaged. Just empty in the way a house is empty when people have left it deliberately. Closets with gaps where clothes had been taken. A counter with items removed but not all items. A child's backpack gone from the hook by the door, leaving the hooks clean where something had hung. Someone had packed and left. Liam came back downstairs carrying a piece of paper. He showed me a note, handwritten, dated about 3 weeks into the outbreak. Liam, we've gone to Evelyn's in Northport with the Kellermans. Patrick is fine. I hoped you would come. Please follow us if you can. See. He stood there reading it. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket. I asked if he knew Evelyn. He said it was Colleen's sister. He said Northport was about 60 miles north. I said, that's within the transport range. The ferry operation coming in. It's working the northern coast. He said, you think? I said I couldn't promise anything, but Northport was north, and the transport operation was working north, and Evelyn was a name, and names were specific. Specific was something you could work with. He looked at the note in his hand. But he said, okay. We went back. Day 41, Thursday. I'm writing this on the morning of day 41, and I know what the next few days need to be, so I'm going to write what I know and leave space for what I don't. We made it back last night without incident. The boat was where we'd left it. The water was calm. Harwick was lit from the storage building's lantern. Someone had kept a lamp burning, which I'd told people not to do, but couldn't be angry about. Terry was awake. He was always awake these days. He came to the dock when he heard the engine cut, and he helped us tie off, and he looked at our faces and didn't ask questions right away. Liam went up to camp. Terry looked at me and said, "He find what he needed?" I said, "Not exactly." I said, "Maybe better." Terry nodded and said, "Good." We stood on the dock for a while. The water was doing its thing, flat and dark and patient. Terry said, "You know what this island is, don't you?" "Harwick." He said it, and then said, "It's a quarantine island." "And your lighthouse station," I looked it up, years ago, for a historical project my wife was doing. In 1903, during a typhoid outbreak, they used this island to quarantine people coming off ships. For 6 weeks, they kept the sick ones out here while the coast cleared. I looked at the lighthouse, the dark shape of it against the stars. I thought about Keeper Hartwell, station in good order. I thought about what he must have seen from this hill, what tides had brought, and what tides had carried away, what the island had held when it needed to. Terry said, "Seemed worth noting." I said, "Yeah, it did." Day 44, Sunday. 17 days until the transport window opens. 14 until we need to start moving to the Ledge Islands for the rendezvous. Today, supply check, equipment check, boat maintenance. Walter and I spent 4 hours going over both engines, the Pathfinder's twin outboards and the single on Terry's boat, both functional. Walter adjusted the timing on the Pathfinder's starboard engine, which had been running slightly rough since the supply run. I watched him work and realized this man, who'd been silent for most of his time on the island, was someone whose hands knew exactly what they were doing. Owen has been organizing the group's combined inventory. His idea, not mine. He approached me 2 days ago with a draft inventory system in his own notebook, categories and columns, and asked if he could take it over from Claire's system, which was good, but hadn't been updated since the group grew. I told him yes. He's been at it for 3 days, careful and thorough, updating Claire's ledger rows with new data, and adding a section for equipment and medicines and personal items of group utility. Watching him work, I thought about his question on the rock that night. Did I know? And I chose us. And he said good. I've been thinking about that good for days. He's going to be okay. More than okay. He's going to be, I don't have the word for it, the kind of person who knows how to function when things are bad, and knows it. That's not a small thing. Nora has a project. She's collecting the sea glass and making what she calls a map, arranging the pieces on a flat stone by color and size to show the shape of the island. She's been at it for a week, and the island shape is recognizable if you know what you're looking at. A woman from Terry's group, a retired art teacher named Phyllis, has been helping her. Nora calls Phyllis Phyllis, and Phyllis seems to find this acceptable. 14 days. Day 48. Thursday. We had a scare today that I need to record because I don't want to minimize it. A boat came in from the east. Unfamiliar vessel, a converted lobster boat, maybe 35 feet, moving at a speed that suggested either engine trouble or deliberate slow approach. 3 or 4 figures visible aboard. I was on the lighthouse hill when I saw it, and I was down and at the dock in 5 minutes. Terry was there already. Walter was there. The lobster boat came in to about 100 yards and stopped. Someone on the bow raised their hands. Standard gesture, non-threatening. They'd had time on the water too. They knew the protocol now. I took the Pathfinder out to intercept rather than letting them dock. There were 4 of them. 3 men and a woman, all adults. One of the men clearly injured, arm in an improvised sling. They'd come from a failed settlement on a distant peninsula, they said. They'd heard about the island from someone they'd passed in the water. I felt the situation. The weight of 4 more people against the supply numbers and the transport timeline and the quarantine window. The woman asked if they could come ashore. She said they hadn't had food in 2 days. I said I needed to ask some questions. I asked where they'd been, who they'd been in contact with, whether anyone in their group had been bitten or had any exposure in the last 2 weeks. 3 of them said no, clearly, immediately. The 4th, the man with the injured arm, said, "The arm is from a fall, not a bite." I asked him directly, "Are you certain?" He said yes. Silence on the water between the boats. I made a decision. I said we had a quarantine process, and they needed to understand it and agree to it before they came ashore. I said we had food, and I would feed them immediately, because 2 days without food was not a quarantine matter. It was a basic matter. But they would need to wait, separate from the main group, in a visible location on the island, for 10 days. If they were clean after 10 days, they were part of the group. The man with the arm said, "You'd leave us separate for 10 days." I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Fair." Their names, Donald, Reggie, Carl, who had the arm, and a woman named Faye. They've been set up in the keeper's house, which I'm comfortable with for short-term habitation. I'm bringing them food twice a day. Faye immediately started trying to be useful, offering to help with something, anything, within the limits of quarantine. I said she could do the evening radio watch from the keeper's house window if she could hear Nadia's channel on the backup handset. She said she'd done radio communications in a previous job. I said okay. 4 more people. 10 days. Transport window. 9 days from now. The math was tightening. Day 51, Sunday. I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of the radio. Not Nadia's frequency. The civil defense receiver I'd been keeping in the inner room as a backup, still running through its shortwave frequencies on slow scan. It picked up something, and the volume was set just high enough to wake me. A voice. American English. Formal, but not robotic. A person reading from notes. It was giving information about a coastal resettlement operation. I grabbed the receiver and held it close. The voice was saying, "All verified offshore groups should prepare for transport window opening approximately 5 days from this broadcast. Transport vessels will circulate through the island chain from north to south. Groups should prepare full manifests and be at the Ledge Island rendezvous by 48 hours before scheduled pickup. Radio contact at standard offshore frequency. 5 days, not 9. The window had moved forward. I woke Liam. He woke the others. Terry came over from the keeper's house in his coat. Patricia behind him. We all stood in the storage building while I played the recording back. I'd managed to hold down the record function on the unit's old tape mechanism, which still worked, and got the last 30 seconds of it. 5 days. Donald, Carl, Reggie, and Faye had been in quarantine for 3 days. I said it out loud. We had a problem. Day 51, continued. The group talked it through. All of us, including Donald's group through the keeper's house window. I stood outside and relayed, and they responded. The options were, leave them behind and go to the Ledge Islands rendezvous, take them with incomplete quarantine, and risk being refused transport by the Connolly's clearance process, or delay going to the Ledge Islands by 2 days and extend their quarantine to 5 days, not 14, not 10, but at least 5, and go together. Nadia weighed in by radio. She said she'd relay the situation to the Connolly and see whether partial quarantine plus close monitoring would be accepted. She said she'd have an answer within 6 hours. 6 hours, Donald said through the keeper's house window. And I want to record this accurately, he said. If it comes down to us or everyone else, you go without us. That's obvious. Don't make it complicated. Carl said, Donald. Donald said, no. We've known these people 3 days. They've been here 40-some days. It's not a choice. He was talking through the window frame, his voice flat and careful. Just make sure you send somebody back if there's a way. I said I'd come back personally if there was a way. He said, okay then. Nadia's answer came in 4 hours, not 6. The Connolly would accept groups with partial quarantine documentation if they submitted to a physical health screening on arrival at the offshore station. The screening would be performed by naval medical personnel. Anyone showing symptoms would be quarantined offshore pending full assessment. Donald's group could come. I relayed this through the keeper's house window. Faye said, oh, just that. Just oh. Day 53, Tuesday. We left Harwick. I need to write that and sit with it. We left Harwick. The loading took most of the morning. Both boats running loads to the Ledge Islands. The Pathfinder and Terry's boat, 4 trips each. Equipment, food supplies, what we weren't leaving behind. Personal gear in limited quantities. The radio equipment from the storage building. I did not take this logbook at first. I went back for it. The last thing I did on Harwick was walk up to the lighthouse. I went up the stairs, past the 2 missing risers, into the lantern room, and I looked at the water in every direction. The mainland coast was visible to the west and northwest, the low edge of land with its haze. The Ledge Islands visible to the south-southeast, low and dark. The open Atlantic to the east and south, enormous and blue-gray and endlessly itself. I could see the Connolly. In the morning light, hull up on the horizon, closer than I'd ever seen it. 18 miles, maybe, moving south along the island chain. Coming. I stayed in the lantern room for a few minutes. Long enough. Then I went down and got in the boat. Owen was at the helm. I'd been teaching him, and he'd been getting good, precise, and careful with throttle control. He moved the boat away from the dock without touching anything, clean and easy, and turned south toward the Ledge Islands. I sat in the bow and looked back at the island as we pulled away. The lighthouse on its hill, the storage building visible below it, the dock getting smaller, the south beach where we'd handled things that needed handling, the pitch pines where Liam had lived for 6 weeks before he found us. When the island was small enough on the horizon that I had to look for it to find it, I looked forward. Day 54, Wednesday. The Ledge Islands. All 29 of us now with Donald's group included, and Nadia's original 17. Crowded, windswept, exposed. Nothing comfortable about it. But Nadia's organization was evident everywhere. The spaces used efficiently, the radio running on schedule, the food distribution regular. The Connolly was visible in the morning. Closer, maybe 12 miles now. We spent the day on documentation, full manifests. Every person's name, age, health status as documented, length of time in the isolated group, any medical conditions requiring ongoing care. I listed Nora's asthma. I listed Carl's arm injury, which was genuinely from a fall. I'd looked at the wound when he arrived, and it was consistent with an impact on a hard surface. Nadia transmitted the manifests on the SSB radio. The Connolly acknowledged. That afternoon, a rubber inflatable came off the horizon, moving fast, with 2 uniformed figures aboard. They landed on the Ledge Island's main beach and introduced themselves. A petty officer and a medical technician. They moved through the group with professional efficiency, asking questions, taking temperature readings, looking at eyes and skin and movement. One person, from Nadia's original group, a young man named Aaron, who'd had a persistent cough for weeks, was flagged for further screening. He looked stricken. The medical technician spoke to him quietly, away from the others, for several minutes. Then she came back and said the cough appeared to be a respiratory infection, consistent with prolonged outdoor exposure, not anything else. She gave him a course of antibiotics from the supply bag she carried. He cried a little. He tried not to. He wasn't all the way successful. Donald's group was cleared. Faye burst into tears when the petty officer said so, and then looked embarrassed, and Donald put his arm around her shoulders. Day 55, Thursday. The transport vessel arrived at 7 in the morning. Not the Connolly, a civilian vessel, as promised. A former passenger ferry, gray-painted, running lights on, moving at careful speed through the island chain. It was 140 feet long, and it had been refitted with open deck space, where the passenger seating had been cleared. There were people visible on the decks. Other survivor groups. Different islands, different stories. All that same combination of gaunt and still standing that we'd all developed. The ferry came to anchor about 300 yards off the Ledge Islands and sent small boats for us. Group by group, load by load. I was in the last small boat off the Ledge Islands. Nadia was in it with me, having done the final radio confirmation with the Connolly. Liam was already aboard the ferry. As we pulled away from the Ledge Islands, I looked back at them. Rock and grass and one stunted tree. The radio equipment was still on the largest island. The Connolly was going to send someone to recover it. There was something strange about leaving a piece of equipment running in a place nobody was going to be. On the ferry, I found Owen at the rail, looking south. He was doing the same thing I'd been doing all morning, looking at things that were going away. I stood next to him, and we looked south together, in the direction of Harwick, which was below the horizon, and invisible now. He said, "Think we'll go back?" I said I didn't know. He said, "I think we will." I said, "Maybe." He said, "The dock needs that plank fixed, the one the storm took." I looked at him. He said, "I'm just saying, we'd have to fix it if we went back." I said, "Yeah, we would." Day 55 continued. The ferry's destination was an island called Kessler Point, 93 miles north. A larger island, inhabited before, and now re-inhabited as a protected settlement. The ferry made 3 stops along the way to collect other groups. A family of 8 from a coastal headland, 11 people from another island I didn't know the name of, a single older woman who'd been on a boat alone for 31 days, and who came aboard and sat down on the deck and didn't move for 3 hours. We arrived at Kessler Point at 11 at night. I'm not going to write about all of Kessler Point right now because I don't have the bandwidth for it tonight. But I'll say, it's real. There are structures. There are people. There is something that looks like, I keep stopping before I write the word. It feels premature. Organization. Sustained. Something that has been built over time and is still standing. The woman who met us at the Kessler Point dock said her name was Ruth, and she was one of the settlement's coordinators. She said we were the 27th group to arrive, and that they had over 400 people now. She said there was a medical facility. There was food production. There were more people coming. She said, "You'll eat tonight and sleep in a dry building, and in the morning we'll get you sorted." Nora, who had been asleep on Claire's shoulder for most of the boat ride, woke up when the ferry docked and looked at the lights of Kessler Point, actual electric lights, powered by something they had running, and said, "Where are we?" Claire said, "Somewhere new." Nora thought about this. Then she said, "Is there a bed?" Ruth, standing nearby, said, "There's a bed, yes." Nora said, "Okay," and put her head back on Claire's shoulder. Day 56. Friday, Kessler Point. A real bed. Not like a hotel, not like anything comfortable in the conventional sense. A cot in a large room with 30 other cots, separated by curtains. The kind of practical arrangement that an organized settlement builds when it's prioritizing function over comfort. But a real mattress. A blanket that was clean. I slept for 10 hours without waking. In the morning, Ruth's settlement gave us a proper orientation. The facility was built around a former marine research station, laboratory buildings, dormitory structures, a processing facility now converted to food operations. Power came from a wind turbine array and a diesel backup. Food came from aquaculture operations, a small farm on the island's interior, and fishing. A lot of fishing. They had a doctor. They had a dentist. Nora discovered this and reacted with entirely predictable mixed feelings. They had people who were organizing medical supply runs to the mainland's coastal fringe, working with the Connolly and 2 other Navy vessels to identify and clear safe extraction routes. And they had communications. Real communications. Satellite. One receiver that still had intermittent uplink. Not reliable, not good, but functional. Liam went to the communications room on his first full day at Kessler Point and gave them the name Colleen, Northport, the name Evelyn. The woman running communications, a former network engineer named Dee, said she'd see what she could do. She said it without guarantees, without false hope, just she'd see. Day 60. Tuesday. On the morning of day 60, I went to the Kessler Point dock and looked south. The ocean was doing what it always does, which is move, regardless of everything. I thought about Harwick Island, the lighthouse on the hill, the storage building that had started as debris and ended as home, the South Beach, the pitch pine shelter that Liam had built and slept in for 6 weeks before he trusted us enough to knock on the door. I thought about the man in the skiff with the bite wound and the twitching hand. I thought about the infected that had come to the storage building door and leaned its weight against the wood. I thought about the morning I stood on the lighthouse hill with my cold coffee and saw the columns of smoke. I thought about the 30% of me that was screaming before any of this started, when it was still just patterns and radio traffic, and a fishing captain being told to continue his route. Claire found me on the dock. She stood next to me and looked south. She said, "D got a response." I looked at her. She said, "There's a group in Northport. They have radio contact with the ferry network. A woman named Evelyn." I said, "And?" She said, "Colleen is there. Patrick too." I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "Liam's in the communications room." I said I should go in. She said, "Give him a minute." We stood on the dock together, and I watched the water. Then she said, "Garrett, come inside, have breakfast." I said, "Yeah." I turned away from the water and went inside with her. Behind us, the dock pilings were doing their thing, the water working at the wood with all its patient persistence, and the morning light was flat and gray, and the ocean was every color it knows how to be, which is all of them. These are the last pages of the logbook. I've been writing in every blank space since day one. If you're reading this and I'm not here to explain it, my name is Garrett Holt. My wife is Claire. My son is Owen. My daughter is Nora. We're alive. We were alive through all of this. We went to an island because I read a pattern in things that weren't making sense, and I chose my family over the uncertainty of being wrong. I don't know if that was right. I know we're here. I know the dock at Harwick needs a plank fixed. Maybe we'll go back one day. That island kept us alive. It's been doing that since 1903, holding people while the coast cleared, just doing the simple fundamental thing, which is being somewhere isolated and solid in cold water.